Okay. Good morning and welcome to the 8th meeting of the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee in 2024. I have received no apologies for today's meeting. The convener is unable to attend today's meeting physically and will therefore be joining us remotely, so I will be convening the meeting as Deputy Convener. Today, the committee will take evidence from two panels on the Abortion Services Safe Access Zones Scotland Bill. As she is the member in charge of the bill, Gillian Mackay MSP will not participate in the committee's scrutiny by virtue of Rule 9.13 Alpha.2 Bravo. Ross Greer will attend in her place as a committee substitute by virtue of Rule 12.2 Alpha.2. Our first evidence session is to explore the impact of the bill for those who are against the introduction of safe access zones. Before we begin, I will provide a brief introduction to the session. The evidence we will hear today will be in relation to the proposed establishment of safe access zones, and we'll be hearing from individuals with lived experience as a consequence. As such, some of the content of this meeting may be sensitive or potentially distressing, and the committee encourages anyone affected by any of the issues discussed today to seek support. If anyone attending today needs to take a break during the session, then please just indicate this to myself. I welcome to the meeting Margaret Ackers and Bishop Keenan, who will be attending in person, and all others are attending virtually. Alina Dogegru, Isabel Vaughan Spruce, and Dr. Mark Pickering, Chief Executive of the Christian Medical Fellowship. And, of course, in person we have Bishop John Keenan, Vice President of the Bishops' Conference of Scotland and the Bishop of Paisley, and Margaret Ackers, Services Coordinator for the Society of the Protection of Unborn Children in Scotland. So thank you all for appearing to give evidence to the committee this morning. I know some of you are sharing personal experiences. We really appreciate you joining us to help inform the committee's scrutiny of this bill. Please note there is no pressure or expectation to share anything that you're not comfortable with today. Again, please let us know if you would like to take a break at any point. I understand Alina and Isabel will begin by setting out their experiences and views on the proposed establishment of safe access zones. So I would like to invite Alina to address us first of all. Thank you.
My name is Alina Dulgheriu. In 2011, I was single, abandoned, facing unemployment and terrified when I discovered I was pregnant. I booked an appointment for an abortion. I just didn't seem to have any other option. My baby wouldn't know her father and had little in the way of financial or emotional support. I wanted to keep her, but I didn't know how, so my hope rapidly began to fade. The day that I turned up to my abortion appointment, a volunteer outside the clinic gently gave me a leaflet. Somewhere beneath the palpable anxiety and pressure, I felt it provide me with exactly what I was longing for. Some will say I already chosen abortion, but the truth is I didn't choose it. The pro-life vigil gave me the hope I was searching for. Had I not received the support for volunteers, my beautiful daughter will not have been here today. I weighted up the two options I had before me, and I chose motherhood. I chose to accept help. It wasn't easy, but with the support of the group who had given me that leaflet, I couldn't be proud of the life my daughter and I have charted out together. In 2019, at the Court of Appeal, I legally challenged the UK first buffer zone set up by SPO in England, Ealing, on the grounds of infringements of freedom of expression. That is why I'm alarmed at this attempt to introduce safe access zone in Scotland. This will criminalise volunteers outside abortion clinics, such as the one who approached me. No one will deny that visiting an abortion clinic can be distressing, but I didn't feel threatened or harassed by being handed a leaflet. It is worrying that we will consider denying vulnerable women access to this potential life-changing information, especially when facing one of the most challenging decisions of their lives that could have lasting ramifications on their mental and physical health. Removing the option to receive help to keep a child in case we feel offended is deeply patronizing and assumes that women can't make a decision for ourselves or that we might choose the wrong option. My case is not one-off. There are hundreds of women just like me who have benefited from this support. Yet, we are all too often ignored as we mind the single-minded race to encourage unquestioning access to abortion for vulnerable women. All the women who would rather keep their babies than have abortion will be denied valuable assistance in the Planet Safe Access Zone. Law turns everyone who volunteer advice into criminals.
Thank you very much, Alina. I'd now like to invite Isabel to address the committee.
Thank you. I've been praying near abortion centres, speaking to women or couples there for around 20 years, and I organise a volunteer group in this capacity. With my group in Kings Norton in Birmingham, we used to stand in twos or occasionally threes near the abortion centre. We never had any posters at all and simply offered a leaflet of help to anyone entering with the words, "Can I offer you a leaflet?" We know many, many women who felt empowered to make the choice they wanted to make to continue their pregnancy because of the support we offered them, which might be financial support, accommodation, childcare, friendship, baby goods, private medical care, etc. Essentially, services not offered by the abortion providers. Some of the locals in Birmingham campaigned to bring in a buffer zone, despite us offering to discuss any concerns they had. The police even arranged a meeting for us, abortion staff, locals and council members to attend, but we were the only ones who bothered to show up. Since the onset of the Birmingham buffer zone in 2022, I've been arrested simply for standing silently near the closed abortion centre. The justification being that this was intimidating service users. It was closed. There were no service users. After having to clear my name in court, I was rearrested 2 weeks later, being told my silent prayers were an offence. My concerns are this is what will end up happening in Scotland. Since it's clear this isn't really about women being harassed, we have laws for that, and all campaign leaders would willingly work with any authority to condemn harassment. From my experience, any women who've been anxious going for an abortion, apart from concerns about the abortion itself, were anxious about what they thought we might do because of the negative and twisted stories that are written about pro-lifers. What people hear or read about us is the chief cause of anxiety, and to my knowledge, this issue hasn't really been addressed at all. My volunteers now pray outside the nearest Catholic church, a long way from the abortion centre. Locals have now said they want the church moved, and my volunteers have been screamed at, spat at, sworn at, even physically assaulted. Viewpoint-based censoring will inevitably expand beyond the buffer zone. This zone's created a huge amount of division in the area, with locals who support us telling me they're terrified that their neighbours might find out what their beliefs are. The community's become polarised, and it's fostered the sense of intolerance, which was the real issue to start with. Pro-lifers have been demonised. We've even had politicians calling us perverts. This has got to stop. We now have a whole section of society being treated as social pariahs for offering help to pregnant women, and proposed new legislation is simply endorsing this. I wholly recommend that the Scottish Government protect freedom of thought and speech in Scotland and promote tolerance as opposed to censorship. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. We'll now move to questions from the whole panel, and I'd like to invite Ivan McKee to start.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel, and thanks for coming along this morning, virtually or in person. Be really keen to get your perspective on a number of aspects of the bill. The first thing I'd like to explore is round about the way that the bill focuses on behaviours, and it's defined as behaviours that may cause harassment, alarm or distress, as you're aware. So the first question is, how does that wording, in your experience, relate to the activities that are conducted by groups standing outside abortion provision centres? And do you see, so the question, how does that wording relate to what you experience that occurs outside the centres. So I don't know who wants to go first.
Thank you very much. And just to say that we're grateful for this opportunity to speak to the committee so that we can present the views of those who hold pro-life views and who want to hold these vigils, and also, as Isabel said, that to try to help women who may well want help at that particular point. Behaviour, Ivan, is as the police described, it is static, peaceful vigils. That's the behaviour. So it would be, in effect, as far as we can see, criminalising static, peaceful vigils.
Just to reiterate what Bishop John has said, pro-life vigils in Scotland are a peaceful presence, primarily there to pray and not a protest. There's never been an arrest relating to pro-life vigils, and Police Scotland have confirmed, both in writing and to this committee, as I understand, that existing legislation is sufficient in the event of intimidation and harassment, but no behaviour of pro-life vigils has ever met that threshold. To echo a concern raised by Isabel, the proposed bill makes explicit mention to silent vigils and to prayer. To criminalise prayer and thought is an alarming precedent to set, and one that I would encourage this committee to consider the ramifications of, and how thought and silent prayer might fit that description that Mr. McKee has stated.
Okay, thanks. I don't know if anyone online wants to comment on that issue. Okay. I mean, moving on from that, I suppose we'd be interested in understanding how, if the bill is passed and those behaviours are protesting outside clinics is made illegal, how that would impact on the individuals who take part in those protests at the moment. We heard some evidence in private session on this, so I'd be really keen to get your perspective on that this morning as well.
The individuals who take part in the
protest.
Individuals. I think, as Isabel made the point, I think we are concerned that that it is essentially the pro-life view is a view that is fairly mainstream in Scottish society. It's held reasonably. It's held, those who would hold it, they would hope on the basis of some scientific evidence of the nature of what happens in the womb. We would say the child in the womb. That's how we would put it. So it's a reasonable position to hold in Scottish society. It's held by the Catholic Church in Scotland, and it is held in good faith. So our concern is, as was expressed, I think, by Alina, is that it almost is saying that to be pro-life is inappropriate. To be pro-life is unacceptable. And remember, there is the provision in this bill to extend it to GP clinics, to counselling services, to pharmacies. So potentially this bill allows for these zones where it's unacceptable to be pro-life in Scotland. So I think laws affect social perceptions. And I think we need to be really careful that if we go down the road of legislating for this, it really makes almost, in popular opinion, unacceptable the position to be pro-life.
Right, thanks. I think the human rights issues and the wider impact and the issue of silent prayer is something we're going to come on and talk about later in the session, but we'll certainly come back to that. Final point I was... Oh, sorry, please. No.
Dr Pickering, would you like to come in? Sorry.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute. You've asked the question about protest, but I think it's very significant that the word protest does not occur in the text of the bill. The offence that is being created is that of influencing anyone who may wish to access abortion. and the bill is called the Safe Access Zones. As we've heard already, I don't think there's an issue about safety for those trying to get to premises or even access. The real question is about influence. And there is an assumption by much of the evidence or the discussion around this that any influence which might lead a woman to make a different choice, such as Alina did, that influence is always negative, and it's put in terms of protest. You know, we're given the impression that people will be shouting or waving placards, and I think Isabel's very cogently talked about the perception that is given, but actually we're generally talking about the provision of information, and so that is definitely that would be an effect of this bill, to reduce the information that is being given to women. I think it's really important to be clear that in that question of influence, which is central to the bill, in a really polarized ethical issue such as abortion, there are very few neutral spaces, there are very few neutral opinions, and the opinions of those who want to see this bill brought, who want to raise concerns about protests, as they would call it, they are often highly polarized in one direction. And even the staff within abortion premises, they are not neutral themselves. They may be very nice people, but still there is certainly a tendency to influence a woman in one direction, because that is, where the staff have gone to. So this question of influence it assumes that influence is always negative, whereas we've seen from Alina's story that influence can be incredibly positive, and it may simply be the provision of information. So that's my overriding concern, that the bill would bring in a banning of alternative information for women who are often not coming for an abortion because they are settled on this decision. They're often torn. They're often in two minds, as Alina was. They're often very distressed and disturbed. And simply having someone who says, "Do you know what? There is some support if you want to make a different choice, and we can talk with you if you'd like that." That can be really life-changing and transformative for many women. And this bill is seeking to ban that and limit women's access to that.
Thanks very much. I think thanks for the point you made about the terminology. I think that it'd be good to get the views and the views of others on the panel as to whether the information that you understand is provided in the clinics reflects that balanced view, and if there's options presented and counselling and other support there as part of that process, and what your perspective on that might be, because that's again something that we've heard in private sessions. I don't know if anyone's got any reflections on that.
Absolutely. So part of my role at SPUC is to work with women to help give them a platform to speak about their experiences of abortion. And while it's not universal, a great number of the women I work with do not feel that they were properly counselled at a clinical level ahead of their abortion, and do not feel that they were given all of the information in order to make an informed choice about alternative options available to them, about services that they could make use of, because the reason that they were considering abortion was primarily to do with external circumstances, and nobody took the time to address those external circumstances that were pushing them in a particular direction. And so, again, I wouldn't say that's the universal experience of women, but I know a great number of women for whom that is the case. And ultimately, that is who pro-life vigils want to reach. And to go back to your previous question about the impact on those who participate in vigils, I do know that this committee has heard from women who participate in vigils as a result of their own experience of abortion. And I think it's very easy to sort of see the group of vigil participants and the group of women attending for abortion or who have had abortions as being two separate circles. But there is quite a lot of overlap, and I think it's important to look at the situation with that nuance. And in fact, it's people's experiences of abortion that have made them feel called to offer this lifeline to other women so that they can reach them in their time of need, where they felt that somebody wasn't there for them and felt that somebody didn't meet their need. And I think it's important to consider that nuance in this situation, is that it's not so clearly one side and another side in this issue. There's quite a bit of overlap. And so I think that's something that's very important to consider.
Yeah, no, it was certainly what we recognised in the private evidence sessions we heard on this on this matter. I think, is it Elena that wanted to come in? Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to add from my own experience when I went to an abortion clinic that I've asked for help if there's alternative of abortion, because I didn't want to. And they said they only offer abortion and there's no other help. And I already was in distress and upset because I didn't have any other options, and not even friends or family will support. So I received help from complete stranger. And it's hard to believe that someone you don't know will actually give you 100 support, but abortion facilities, they will not offer this option that some women they are looking for. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Final. Sorry, please. Yeah. Dr. Pickering.
Thank you very much. I think the question of information provision is highly important, and as Alina has just said, the provision or the information given in abortion clinics will often be around, here is the procedure, here is what the procedure will do for you, and then a discussion of perhaps potential complications around it. Women going there will not generally be talked to about the kind of information that, say, in a pregnancy crisis centre might be offered, so financial support, community support, and other ways. And then there is very often, again, highly polarised discussion about what kind of evidence is discussed. So if we look at evidence for how does an abortion affect the mental health of women, for instance, we will often hear pro-abortion campaigners saying that there is no evidence that an abortion can affect the mental health of a woman detrimentally. And yet we hear first-hand testimony from thousands of women who go to pregnancy crisis centres, sometimes for post-abortion support, who will eloquently say about the extreme mental distress that is caused by the memory of the abortion that they went through. And when we're looking at published evidence from journal articles and studies, again, that is highly contested. There are campaigns going on right now that published articles in journals that show that there may be some negative mental health consequences in some circumstances for abortion. There are campaigns to have these journal articles retracted, not just for there to be debate or for another journal article to show a different side, but actually for the journal to say we should never have published this. And it's highly politicized, polarized and contested. And there is definitely a campaign to show that there are no negative consequences from abortion. And I think that needs to be done responsibly. But very often you will hear from pro-abortion campaigners that pro-life campaigners will misuse evidence, use misinformation, that sort of thing. And occasionally that may be true. We certainly need to make sure that evidence is given in a responsible fashion and it's discussed appropriately. And at the Christian Medical Fellowship, we're really keen that any person providing pro-life information at a pregnancy crisis centre has got really good evidence that they can discuss in an appropriate way. But we mustn't believe that people on the other side of a polarized debate are neutral, and there really is a campaign to suggest that, or to make it seen that everyone who has reservations about abortion is lumped in with the crazy COVID skeptics who would deny that COVID was even a problem, for instance, and we must be really careful about that.
Great, thanks very much. I think from a committee's point of view, and we can connect on this later, but if there are data sources, I think that would be helpful, because this issue has come up in some of the sessions from different perspectives, and it would be good to actually get our hands on some specific articles on that. So thanks very much. I'll finish there. Thank you. Convener.
Call Ross Greer.
Convener, I'd like to just pick up on the point that Margaret was making in answer to the first question around this being about prayer, not just protest. Obviously, the right to prayer and the right to protest are protected differently and to different extents in different pieces of human rights legislation. My first question, though, is from a personal perspective as a Christian, it's a theological one. So, Bishop Keenan, I hope you don't mind me coming to you first on this one. How important is proximity to prayer? Because from my perspective, I'm not aware of a reading of Scripture that emphasises the importance of proximity for the purpose of prayer.
Yes, theological question. I think there probably is. So place is important. So for Christianity, we are an incarnational religion. Now that means that for us, we believe that God in Jesus Christ came in a particular time, in a particular place. So that makes place and time not just important, but absolutely crucial for our point of view. Places were important. So people could pray in their own homes. Absolutely. Jesus said, go to your private room and pray. But he also went to the temple. And that was really important, to go to the temple. He says, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there in your midst. And he said, go into the whole world, proclaim the good news to all creation. So I think, let me put it another way. If we're saying that the Christian point of view is that you only have to pray, and it's only natural to pray or important to pray in privacy, then I don't think that would be a Christian point of view.
You mentioned there where Jesus said about going into private rooms to pray. So that's in Matthew 6. What comes immediately before that is criticism of those who pray performatively for others to see them. And you mentioned Jesus did go to the temple, but the temple is the place that people go to. It's the place that people would go to and expect to see others pray. So I think that there's a distinction between praying in a faith setting, in a faith institution, in our case in a church, as opposed to in a public setting like this. So what I'm struggling with here from the Christian perspective, accepting that not everybody who takes part in the pro-life vigils comes at it from a Christian perspective, but obviously the panel we've got today, that's largely the case, is Scripture is actually really very critical of Jesus directly, immediately before introducing the Lord's Prayer, is critical of people who pray performatively, and he calls on people to go and pray in private spaces. So if what you're saying this morning is that the importance here isn't the protest, it's the prayer, I can't understand the basis for that as a point of belief, because what Scripture tells me is that we should not pray like that. Jesus is quite explicitly critical of people who pray like that.
Yeah, so I'll probably say 2 things. First of all, Ross. First of all, I think where you're going with that could be problematic for human rights, because you seem to me to be making a distinction between freedom of worship and freedom of religion, right? Which is actually something that does worry us as bishops in Scotland. The European Convention and the Universal Declaration is freedom of religion, which is the freedom to be able to profess your faith in the public square. And there have been attempts to revise that to freedom of worship, which is that you are entitled to pray, but only in a church. We worry about that, because what it does is that it means you are enclosing religion in houses of worship, whether they be mosques, whether they be temples, whether they be synagogues, or whether they be churches. That's not what the Universal Declaration of the European Court of Human Rights, the European Convention of Human Rights, talks about. So I think we need to be careful about that. But I think also in the Scriptures, Jesus wasn't saying don't pray publicly. He was saying don't pray in such a way that you make yourself proud or arrogant. I think that's what he was really saying there. It wasn't about don't give a public witness, as far as I can see.
Thanks. I should say, obviously, I'm not suggesting that you should...
just advise that Isabel Vaughan, Bruce and Dr Pickering would also like to come in.
Yeah, I'm very keen actually to speak to Isabel specifically about that. I didn't want to leave the point lying. I'm not suggesting that you should only be allowed to pray in a private space, i.e. in a church, but from a Christian perspective, that's certainly what we're encouraged to do. But obviously our rights, the point that you make, Bishop, about our rights are conditional, because sometimes rights are contested and people's rights can clash up against each other. So I think the idea that there should be unconditional, unfettered rights for some people to do some things, it clashes with other people's right to do other things. And this is about how we balance rights. I think we would all acknowledge there's a balance of rights perspective here.
I agree with that, Ross. But this one, see, silent prayer, that's tantamount to being a thought. It's a thought. So actually, as far as we can see as the Catholic Church, if you're criminalising silent prayer, you're criminalising people's thoughts. And I know that when the police were giving evidence last week, they were worried about that. And I think of the human rights that are absolute and that can't be balanced is freedom of thought. Other ones could be freedom of, where you... So many other rights can be balanced. But I think freedom of thought is the one, I think, which is absolute, which means that's not to be balanced against anything. So I think that includes silent prayer.
Thanks very much. Isabel, I'd be particularly interested in your perspective on this, because you mentioned in, I think, your opening comment that your volunteers in Birmingham now pray outside a church, which is much further away from the abortion provider. So I suppose my question for you is, if it's prayer rather than protest, is that not okay to be doing it at or outside the church rather than at the abortion provider?
Well, thanks for giving me the chance to respond to that. And I do want to keep picking up on this word protest, because I don't organise protests. I've never protested outside an abortion centre. And I think that gives a whole different picture of the work that I do. I hold a vigil, or we have volunteers that maybe gather in groups of 2 or 3, but we're not there protesting. But I do think it's really important to recognise that presence is something that's quite crucial for many Christians, and actually even for those who don't share our faith. I mean, for instance, if you maybe see a road accident, flowers would be left at the scene, or you might see something like a tragedy like 9/11, and people might go and hold a prayer service at that actual place. And for instance, in the case of a situation where there's an accident and people go and lay flowers at the side of the road, or maybe a mountaineer dies and people go and place flowers up the mountain, it's not because those people are necessarily there anymore, or particularly with the case of a road accident, there's nobody there anymore. But that place, that presence is key, because as Bishop Keenan, I think, was alluding to, the fact that we are physical people who operate in space and time. So place is very important for us. For Christians particularly, and for Catholics, I know, as myself being a Catholic, we'll go on pilgrimage to places where things might have happened hundreds of years ago, but that place becomes really crucial to our prayers. And likewise with this case of abortion, it is really important to be at the place where we are praying. And the concern is particularly that, I know for myself with my arrest, that the prayers weren't even being manifested. It wasn't that I was kind of kneeling down, holding rosary beads, or with a Bible in my hand, speaking prayers. They were simply silent, imperceptible thoughts in my head. In fact, the police officers had to ask me, "Are you praying? What are you praying for?" The fact that someone thinks it's okay to be asking somebody those questions which even my spiritual advisors and priests have never asked me, I think that's incredibly intrusive, incredibly concerning from a religious freedom perspective and freedom of thought as well.
Thanks very much. If I could ask you then about the question of proximity. So before the buffer zone was brought in Birmingham, you were praying adjacent to the facility. Now I'd say that you were not allowed to, even before the buffer zone was brought in, you wouldn't have been allowed to pray inside the facility, in the waiting room, or indeed in the room where the procedure is taking place. Do you agree that was an acceptable limit, that placing some kind of limit was acceptable? It wouldn't have been appropriate for you to be praying in the room where the procedure was taking place while it was taking place, and that therefore this isn't a black or white about restriction or no restriction. It's about where we place that restriction.
We've always been very respectful of private property, but we're talking about a public street now, and I think that creates a very different situation when we're talking about somebody can't pray on a public street. So clearly other people are allowed in this street. When I was standing outside the abortion centre, there were people standing on the street in different places around doing different things. They might have been looking at their phones. They might have been stopping to chat with friends. So clearly if it's a public street and we're simply banning thoughts if they're directed towards God, that's really concerning. Even if somebody else doesn't understand why we're doing that or the importance of that, and I appreciate that other people might not understand or believe in all the things that I believe in, but to criminalise my thoughts because they're directed towards God, I think that's actually discrimination.
Thanks for that. If I could just press you a wee bit on that. So the provisions in the bill would provide for these 200-metre zones. Now, in some cases, certainly in Scotland, in some cases, even out with that 200 metres, you would still be on the campus of the provider. So if I just want to make sure I'm getting your perspective correctly and we're recording it correctly, are you saying it would be acceptable, even if it was beyond 200 metres, it would be acceptable for the no protest to take place on the premises, on the campus of the provider? And your argument is that where it's a public space, a public highway, that shouldn't be restricted.
I am talking about public property, and if it's a place where any public people are allowed to go, then I've got particular concerns about that. But if we're trying to restrict silent prayer, I think, again, as what Bishop John was saying, that's a concern anywhere. You know, if we're saying that somebody can't think their own thoughts in a house, in a building, a silent prayer should be allowed anywhere that people are allowed. Because we should never, again, something from the Bible, we're told to pray unceasingly in the Bible. This is something that St. Paul talks about. So for those who believe in the Gospels, believe in the Bible and try and follow that teaching, their prayer is something that actually should be, going with them at all times in some way or another. So even on private property, silent prayer should be allowed, but I appreciate that it's up to the individuals who hold ownership to private property as to who is allowed in that property. But if it's, whenever anyone is allowed in a property, they should be allowed to silently pray there if they wish. But if we're talking about a public street, to say that somebody can't come into that public street, solely on the basis of what they might be thinking, as I say, that's discriminatory.
I completely understand why the emphasis is on the provisions around silent prayer. I'd be interested in your perspective on the other forms of vigil, or what some people would characterise as protest. Your perspective is that silent prayer should certainly not be restricted, and I completely understand that perspective. Where do you come down where it is, what we have seen examples of, where it's the placement of, or people holding placards with provocative messages on them, with images of an unborn baby or a fetus, where we have heard evidence of images being projected onto the wall of a hospital. Obviously, walls have windows, so being projected into the rooms of a hospital as well. So I understand and respect your perspective on silent prayer. I think it'd be really important for us to understand your perspective on the other kinds of activities that have taken place in Scotland, where it is more visual, more provocative. People would characterise it differently, but where there's more to it, if you understand what I'm asking.
I think this is something that Alina spoke into when she said that we've got to be very careful that we don't patronise women just because they are pregnant. Clearly many of these women may be in vulnerable situations, but that vulnerability can go both ways. We know that coercion is a big situation, for instance, with regards to those who are seeking abortions or considering an abortion. And to be able to, if a woman at that stage is so influenced simply by seeing a picture of a baby, then it's quite possible that woman's mind isn't made up as hard and fast as we're often told. The amount of people that I've spoken to who have said to me that, literally until the last second, they weren't sure which way they were going to turn, whether they were going to have an abortion or not. These people should be able to look at it. On
that one, just part of the evidence we've heard is, I think it is important for us to talk about this, it's not just women going in potentially to have an abortion that we're talking about. It's all people accessing a service, and we've heard evidence that women who have had miscarriages or stillbirths are deeply distressed to see these images, and they might be accessing the premises for a completely different reason. You know, in most cases in Scotland, it's a hospital. They could be accessing it for all sorts of reasons, totally unrelated to reproductive health care. But if they've had that kind of experience, seeing these images can be deeply distressing for them as well, not just for pregnant women.
And clearly, somebody who's in a state of distress might be distressed to anything. They might see a woman walking in with a baby in a pram, and that might distress them. When they're in the hospital, they might see someone else who's pregnant. That might distress them because they want to be pregnant, and this person is intentionally ending their pregnancy. There's all sorts of things that might distress people when they're in those situations, and nobody wants anyone else to be distressed. But we can't start making all these things criminal. Unless there's something in and of themselves which is intentionally being offensive. And I don't think any of these things are. I don't think we can say that a picture of a preborn child becomes offensive simply because somebody might get upset at seeing it, any more than somebody carrying a baby is offensive just because it might upset somebody.
Thank you.
We're now reaching the halfway point of proceedings, and I know there are 3 witnesses who wish to make comment on this issue. If I could maybe invite Dr. Pickering and then 2 witnesses in the room, and then we can move on, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think Isabel's given some very helpful comments there, and I think also the Bishop's comments on proximity are helpful. But I think it's the question about prayer and proximity. These things are often combined, and I think if the overall main thrust of a person within this zone is to provide information, then we have to accept that that person may be praying silently in their head whilst offering information. And we've got to be really, really careful about criminalising thoughts. The other thing is, within that access zone, there are various other kinds of prayer which could go on. If a church is sited within an access zone, a church could have a pro-life prayer meeting. It could be advertised that on a certain day of the month that members of that church will be in that church praying for women who are coming to that abortion clinic, perhaps even praying for the staff in a perfectly reasonable way. Now, if that gets out, if that is circulated by pro-abortion campaigners, there could be protests against the church. As Isabel has said, there's now campaigns to move her church, which is nowhere near the abortion clinic that is under consideration. Also, a private individual could have a prayer meeting within their home, which may be situated within a safe access zone. That may be advertised online for those who wish to come, but that is simply prayer focused on people accessing the clinic within the safe access zone. And I think we're really into deep and murky waters if we start to talk about that. But I'd bring the committee back to that question of the wording of the bill. Prayer is not mentioned in the wording of the bill. Protest is not mentioned in the wording of the bill, and neither is vigil. It's influence. And it's the question of, can a prayer in and of itself influence a woman? And so I would love the committee members to consider, are they suggesting that a person praying in their individual home or within a church or silently on the street, as Isabel has done, is that in and of itself influencing them? That is a theological question, whether that silent prayer is causing an influence. I do think there are questions about tastefulness and decency, and I would never support people, parading around with placards of pictures of dismembered fetuses who've been aborted, that sort of thing. And I think we do have to be very careful about the messaging that is given. I would never support people using, having placards that say abortion is murder, etc. But I think, as Isabella said, you cannot start saying that any visibly pregnant woman or any woman with a child must be kept away from the confines of an abortion clinic just in case a woman may feel upset at the thought of what she's about to do, etc., etc. We have to be really careful about that. And the offence is influence, and that's the key here.
Ms. Ackers.
One thing that I think is often missing from this discussion, I think we, in discussing pro-life vigils, talk about the experience of women presenting for abortion as kind of universal in how they view them. And I just want to reiterate that it's much more nuanced than that, and it's simply not true. I know a great number of women who say after their abortion, I wish they were there when I needed them. Those are the exact words that a friend of mine, Haley, shared. And so the experience is not universal, as is the experience of other service users who might be at the hospital for various reasons. If you'll allow me to be a little bit personal, although I recognize that this is not the issue at hand, I myself have had a miscarriage. And what I see pro-life vigils doing is reaffirming the humanity of the child I lost. And I see that as a positive thing. On the day I went to hospital to confirm my miscarriage, I had to walk past the hospital bookstore. It was in February, so there were cards out for Mother's Day. I found that deeply distressing, but at the same time, I'm not campaigning for Mother's Day cards to be removed from shops. We are exposed to things that are upsetting and distressing, and people view them differently. And there are a great number of women, particularly vulnerable women, who are at risk of coercion by a partner, who are in financially terrible straits, or whatever other reason, they're pursuing an abortion that they might otherwise not want. And even some women just say, I was just looking for a sign. I was looking for a sign that I didn't have to do this. And there are people standing out there with signs. And so that's quite literally being present to women at their point of need. Now, I recognize that that's not how all women feel about pro-life vigils, but I just encourage the committee to have a bit of, to see that the perspectives of women vary. And a great number of women presenting for abortion are ambivalent about that decision at best because of the various influences on their life. And so it is a varied experience that women have, and they have varied opinions on seeing a pro-life vigil and seeing the signs that they have and seeing their presence. And if I do anything today, want to echo the voice of those women who were glad vigils were there for them, like Alina, or those who longed for a vigil to be there at their point of need and it wasn't there, some of whom now participate in pro-life vigils. And I think their perspective is particularly important to this discussion. So I do want to add that to just to the record so people are aware that the experience of these women is not a universal one.
If I may just bring in Alina quickly and then Bishop Keenan. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So from my own experience, I've been through, and as well I took part in these vigils. And I can say that the scan are not being shown to the mothers when they go in abortion facilities. Information are being held by these facilities about the mother. They're not allowed to see the scan because they consider this woman incompetent of making a decision on their own. And I think it would be fair that they should have shown these pictures. And if the abortion facility will show this picture, why they find it so problematic if there is a baby inside. And regarding to Margaret, miscarriage, I did have, unfortunately, miscarriage on Mother's Day. And it is a reminder, but just because I had a miscarriage, I would not want to ban Mother's Day. It just doesn't make any sense. Things happen in life. Thank you.
Hey, Bishop Keenan.
Yeah, thanks. Back to the question of location again, because I think this is important. We could take places where location has been important, like Fast Lane. And for years, there was a peace camp there, just outside the nuclear facility. It was important for them that they were at Fast Lane. Similarly, with Dungavel Detention Centre, my predecessor, Bishop John Moon, often went along to the protests as they were. There are vigils outside the Dungavel Detention Centre because presence is important. When they were there, it concentrated minds about what was happening inside in terms of giving the rights and dignity to asylum seekers that they should have had. Similarly, those who were against nuclear weapons, it was important that they were there. So I think this question about being there in terms of pro-life vigils has implications for Fast Lane, has implications for for Dungavel, but the same reasoning that could apply to these pro-life vigils can very easily, just you change the context ever so slightly, can apply against those who are for peace or whatever. So I think that's important. And then back to your point, Ross, yeah, balance. Yeah, no one's saying that there shouldn't be balance. No one's saying people should be inside an abortion facility, right inside it, harassing people. But I think what we're saying here is that balance shouldn't mean that something which is a legitimate point of view should be made invisible. And I think that's what seems to be the case here. It's saying it's okay as long as nobody sees it, or nobody really who's in that facility, in the hospital, sees it. We would say that's not about balance, and therefore I think we'd probably say the laws that are in place, of which there are many, which are laws that the police have, they say there are laws that allow them to deal with if something is harassing, there's a law there for it. If something is threatening, there's a law there for it. If something even causes distress, there's a law that they have in their toolkit for that. They can intervene if they think something is distressing, even. So I think the evidence that I can say of the police is they don't need extra powers. And I sort of pick up from that they don't want extra powers. I don't think they want to be in a position of having to police thoughts. I don't think they want to be in a position of having to police influence. So what would be the solution then? I think, go back to what did happen, as I think was the case at Fastlane. They all got round a table. Those involved in CND and the peace camp, and those from the facility and the police, they all got around a table, and at a local level, they discussed it and they came up with a solution. I think, and that's what we would propose as the church, that to criminalise something is quite a blunt instrument, to criminalise rights is a blunt instrument, but it is a solution. There's a solution, maybe could be introduced into where local authorities, where an application is made to have a vigil or a protest. Something could be in there, which would be discussion, arbitration, mediation. Someone can say, look, we happen to find this poster particularly triggering. OK, well, let's think about using another poster. There is a solution which is around dialogue, negotiation, arbitration, where everyone around the table can see what rights are protected. But when you are talking about rights, and I think this will be the next session, won't it be? When you're talking about rights and you criminalise rights, then that's something I think is a failure. I think we always say that that's a defeat if we had to criminalise rights. And when we do so, I think we have to say every option has been exhausted before you take away a right. It has to be necessary. There has to be no other means of doing this. It has to be proportionate. And in this, I think there's unlimited fines for this. So, and it has to be, this has to be a sort of facility that when the issue is no longer there, it can be taken away, right? So that the right, because that's the important thing, the right can be respected. And I think, therefore, that's why I think it's generally the case that we don't like to criminalise when it's to do with rights.
Carol, can you add a supplementary?
If you don't mind, thank you. Just briefly, it's just, I don't know whether it's Father Keenan or Dr Pickering that might have an opinion on this. It's to do with the influencing. I find your discussion there very, very interesting. And I suppose my question is at the point of time of influence, who is it that we're trying to influence in the different types of gatherings that you were talking about? So are we trying to influence the lawmakers, or are we trying to influence individual people to make different decisions? And I just wondered whether that was a thought with yourselves, or whether you thought, you know, that would be approaching things differently. Thank you.
If they wanted to come in.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very good question. And I think if people are looking to influence lawmakers, then they should be protesting outside Holyrood. And I think that question of proximity is really important. You go to the place where something is happening, and depending on who you want to influence. But to my mind, the chief benefit of what some of my colleagues are talking about is the provision of information in the right context to women who are considering accessing those facilities. And again, it comes down to influence. There is a perception within the wording of this bill that assumes that any influence which might lead a woman or might even give her the confidence to make a decision not to have an abortion, that is always negative. There is an undercurrent within the bill that abortion is essential health care, that women make, black and white decisions. They're always fully decided to do that, and that anyone who gives them any information which might help to dissuade them from that is doing a bad thing. And we've heard that very clearly from Alina, that is not the case. There are many women, or some women, who will go very clear on that. It's not an issue for them. They just want to get it done and go home. And there are many who will go in great distress, in great turmoil, in great, in two minds or more than two minds about what is the right thing to do. And the question is, what is the influence that the staff in the clinic are having over them? The bill doesn't actually discriminate between somebody outside giving information to a woman as she walks in or offering information, and then the staff inside the clinic. Will the committee start to police all the information and the counselling given to the people, to the women inside the clinic by the staff? Certainly, I would have concerns about some of the direction that will go. Yes, abortion providers will talk about trying to be non-directive, but when you have something that is providing us a service which has very polarized views, people who go to work in those clinics will often have the same polarized views. They will not be there from a position of moral and emotional neutrality. And so we have to think very carefully about what is the influence that woman is having from the people in the clinic, whether consciously or unconsciously. We often hear that that women who've gone to clinics, they're not provided with alternatives, and any evidence that they might have heard about perhaps the mental health consequences potentially, that's often denigrated and played down, and that in itself is influence. So we've got to be really, really careful about that.
Sandesh Kulkarni.
Thank you. Just a declaration of interest as a practicing NHS GP. I think that I would like to separate silent prayer and protest. And I want to ask about protest to start with, if I may. Now, Dr. Pickering has said that he would not support placards, shouting, pictures of aborted fetuses. Isabel spoke about how she doesn't organise a protest, but a vigil. So is everyone in agreement that protest, in the way that I've described and in the way Dr. Pickering described, is something that shouldn't happen outside of an abortion clinic?
So protest, we've had a bit of theology. I think that the route for protest is protestare, to speak on behalf of a value. Right, so you're not speaking against something, you're speaking on behalf of a value, protestare. So what a protest is, literally, I think, is someone speaking on behalf of life. It's Fastlane, someone speaking on behalf of peace.
Specifically in the context that I described, not in other contexts.
So in the are we all agreed then that we shouldn't have distressing images outside the clinics? Is that the question?
In the way that Dr. Pickering also described the things that he would not support. Yes,
I think so. I think that's right. I think certainly what we would say is that those. So if we're talking about 40 Days for Life, I think they make efforts not to have what they would consider to be as Mark has said, images of aborted fetuses or things like that. They would have, if there was an image, it would be a living fetus in the womb or something like that. So I think yes, I think we would say if you're outside these centres, you should have positive life images. I think that would be right, yeah.
I think one of the reasons that we are quite staunch on distinguishing between vigils and protests is because vigils are what are happening. And ultimately what this bill is proposing
specifically,
as a...
Michael, we'll come on
yes.
to vigils, but specifically on protest,
yes.
not vigil. So
yes, I understand.
What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So what I mean to say is this bill is supposed to be responding to a current pressing public order problem. And what I'm saying is protests aren't happening. So vigils are what happens outside of all of the providers. The regular events that you might see from 40 Days for Life or other groups are vigils. And this bill is supposed to be getting at what is a current public order problem, and what's happening are vigils, not protests, which is why I draw that distinction. I think that even banning protests would have implications for human rights legislation, and I think that would be something that would have to be carefully considered. But what I mean, the distinction I mean to make is that what is currently happening and what this bill is aiming to get at are these vigils, and that is why we keep coming back to the idea of these vigils and what happens.
I'm sorry, but I was asking specifically. So you would not be against having placards with aborted fetuses, for example, being shown, and you would not be against people shouting in the street outside of clinics?
I would be against those things, but I think current legislation gets at that already.
Okay, fine. So I just wanted to be clear. So there is this distinction, I think, between protest and silent vigils, and that's something that we do need to look at.
I think probably we do. I think in principle, for what Margaret said, we do need to be careful about the word protest. Right. So there is protest, which is something which is a legitimate human right to protest at Fastlane, at Dungable, as I said. Protest is a human right. But you're talking about, so you're not talking about protest. You're saying, do we think it would be wrong, improper, unacceptable to have particularly violent images? That's the question you're asking, isn't it?
But also, shouting in the street and
shouting in the street,
shouting at
right.
people going into a facility.
So you're saying, so if I could just not use the word protest, because I think it's confusing it. If you're asking, would we be against shouting in a harassing or an abusive way? We'd be against that.
Okay, I use protest because Isabel spoke about protest and the difference between what she does with vigils and protests. So if I could move on to ask you...
We come in if you have time.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Dr. Pickering?
Thank you very much. I was just waiting to be unmuted. Yes, I do think that there is a very legitimate distinction between protest and the other things. And I think, Dr. Gullane, the things that you've raised, shouting, pictures of aborted fetuses, I would not support those. I don't think any of my colleagues around the table would support that as well. I think those are covered by current harassment legislation, and I think the police is well able to deal with that. The question really is, I don't think any of us would support anything that is calculated to make a woman feel bad. If that is the intention of it, simply to make somebody feel bad for doing what they have decided to do, I wouldn't see that as productive, and I don't think many of my colleagues would either. The challenge is, how would you police that? And I think the bill itself is really, it's a sledgehammer to crack a nut which doesn't even exist as far as we're aware. I'm not aware of these, of the shouting, pictures of unborn children, of dismembered fetuses being used in Scotland, because if they were, the police would know about it and the police would have stopped it. We might use, because so much of what we're coming down to is not actually about what we traditionally think of as protest. Again, it's influence. It's almost like, the owners of a vegan cafe wanting to ensure that a Kentucky Fried Chicken is not within 200 meters of them because it may make their users feel bad. It may, provoke feelings in them that make them feel uncomfortable. I accept that, but that does not mean that we should be going to those lengths. And as I said, I don't think the kind of protests that you're referring to, I don't think they're happening. I don't think we certainly wouldn't support them. But that would not be the effect of the bill. And really, that's not the effect of those who support the bill, who are campaigners for it. That's not really what they're trying to stop because it's not happening.
I think it was important to draw the distinction and to understand your point of view of what you termed and what Isabel termed as protest and what was being said about silent prayer, which are two, I think, slightly different topics. I do want to ask, I'll open this up to the panel. We heard from the session with the police and from the session with the solicitor that if this bill were to pass, then there will be no distinction between protesting for abortion, both pro and against, or any other forms of protest, regardless of what that protest is. So against El-Jamal or against the board or whatever. What are your thoughts about that?
So I think that I took what they were saying to be that if there's a zone that says that someone may not protest about abortion, then say someone was, I think there was a case in Tayside where there was a protest outside a hospital regarding a healthcare worker who had some kind of case against him.
El-Jamal.
So I think the police were saying that protest couldn't take place either.
Yes.
Yes. So I think that is an implication there that it would have the effect of stopping any and every protest. And you can imagine a number of reasons of people who might feel as though there are concerns about what would happen in a healthcare facility. There might be people concerned about low pay, various other things, working conditions. So I think the effect of it would be that it would have a bigger effect, really, in the police's mind than might be countenanced.
And what do you feel that's right? Do you feel that's wrong?
I think it's a matter for the police. I think if the police are saying that, then I think we want to. They're the ones who are policing it.
Forgive me, I'm asking if you feel it's right that we are not able to protest other things outside of a hospital.
I think, again, part of the general point I would make, I think, as Ross was saying, there's balances to be struck when it comes to protests. But I think, in principle, that it's important that people are able to make their protests at relevant facilities, but with a balance of rights.
Okay. And I suppose I just want to end on this theme. We do have people who go to work in a hospital, and they should go to work without feeling distressed. And we have people who are accessing healthcare, and it doesn't matter what that healthcare is, but we do accept they should be able to access their healthcare without distress. Do you accept that what is happening around Scotland, around the UK potentially, but we really care about Scotland because that's what our Parliament is. Do you accept that this does and can cause distress to healthcare workers, as we heard in other panels? And do you think that that is fair?
I certainly would accept that it would cause or could cause distress. I think having to witness any protest at a place of one's work, whatever that be, Faz Lane, I saw a protest outside Barclays at the weekend. Having to see that as you attend your place of work is distressing. But I think it's important to remember there's a case at the European Court of Human Rights in 1976, Handyside, and I just have a quote from the judgment here. Freedom of expression is applicable not only to information or ideas that are favourably received or regarded as inoffensive or a matter of indifference, but also those that offend, shock, or disturb the state or any sector of the population. So the fact that it's distressing alone is not reason enough to criminalise. And I accept that it may be distressing. I will not accept that it's necessarily distressing for everybody. But that is not reason enough to curtail that freedom of expression.
I would probably add that existing legislation already allows the police to intervene in circumstances of distress. But I think the legislation allows discretion to the police. They're able to say, right, the legislation allows us to intervene for distress. Is this something that we consider to be a distress that relates to a public order issue, or a distress that relates to someone accessing a service? So they've got that discretion already in the law. I think then to use a measuring tape, why use that, which is kind of a blunt instrument, which as already said, as you alluded to, which already will capture a whole lot of other people, when it's probably much better to do it allowing the police the discretion, which I think up until now the laws have tried to factor in.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have covered a lot of ground, but have so much yet to cover. So I'm minded if witnesses are amenable to extend the session by 15 minutes to 11 a.m, if that's agreeable. That's great. I also just want to cover an issue that was brought up in a previous evidence session, which we haven't yet covered, which was a concern raised that information distributed to people accessing abortion clinics by those engaged in activities covered by the bill is not always factually accurate. Perhaps, for example, the medical consequences of the procedure. Do any of the witnesses have a view on ensuring that that is clinically accurate material that is distributed and not necessarily sensationalist or alarmist?
It is my understanding that all the pro-life vigils that currently take place in Scotland do not and have not for years leafleted people going into clinics. Okay. And they do not hand things to people going into clinics. It is my understanding from people who attend that that is the case. They might have certain things on hand, which I believe may have been presented to the committee. They might have certain things on hand if a discussion starts and somebody asks a question that might direct them to further sources of support. But they do not hand out leaflets to everyone who passes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we were able to source the leaflets that I think were referred to. We have them here, if anyone would, if you'd like them. I think they were referred to a blue leaflet and a green leaflet, a blue and a pink leaflet and a colour. These are leaflets that have a London telephone number. So we think these were leaflets which in the past were handed out in England. Looking at them, when I look at them, they're kind of I think they tend to be factually accurate. And in terms of the references, I think the references are NHS and fairly reputable journals. But if you would like them, then we're happy to pass them on to you. Thank you. But as I say, I think that we'll only do those really to, I think, help the committee in terms of leaflets that had been referred to. But I think others would know better than I would. But our understanding is, from having spoken to organisations, that they're not used at all in Scotland.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Pickering?
Thank you very much. I do think there is, as I said before, there is a question about ensuring the accuracy of information that's given. I think all of us around the table would want to see that women are given accurate information. As I said before, that is a highly contested and polarised space, and there is an active campaign amongst academia and media to shut down anything which may suggest that a woman might have a negative consequence from an abortion. There are campaigns to retract journal articles. I was listening to a British Medical Journal podcast about that now. There's a Supreme Court case in the USA that hinges around contested evidence. So yes, we want to make sure that it's accurate, and the Christian Medical Fellowship does work with some pregnancy crisis centres really to try to make sure that the information that they provide is defensible and accurate and appropriate, but we must not assume that abortion providers are neutral in this sense and abortion campaigners, and I think there is very much a polarised opinion about that. And if I may just very briefly come back to what Dr. Gullane said in the last question, I do think there's a really important question about whether this legislation would ban people from protesting about very legitimate and separate concerns at an abortion clinic. If a particular abortion clinic or provider is shown to have been given poor care, unsafe care, or have any other quality or governance concerns, then people should be able to highlight that. And I think there is a danger that this would give carte blanche to poor care from certain abortion providers because there is a sort of a worldview protection because they are operating in a contested space and nobody must question them. I think that is a real concern.
Thank you very much. I want to move to Emma Harper. Thank you.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning to everybody. We've heard a lot this morning about abortion clinics from various witnesses talking about abortion clinics. My understanding is we don't have standalone abortion clinics in Scotland. We have premises that provide healthcare for women. And so I'd be interested in hearing about purposeful influencing outside a premises that is providing a range of healthcare, which could be including counselling. Would you think there would be a need to have any vigils outside a premises if you were guaranteed that women were provided all the range of counselling and services and knowledge in order to make the best informed healthcare decisions?
I think that's a very interesting question. If there were to be some sort of standard to ensure that women had the fullness of information. The trouble is there is already informed consent legislation, which should mean all of those things are covered. And yet we're seeing consistently from the women I work with that they're still not sufficiently getting the information that they feel they're entitled to. And so even if those procedures are in place, it seems like sometimes they're not being met. And I speak from working with the significant number of women on this issue exactly, particularly in cases where coercion has taken place. And so I think if we could be fully satisfied that information and support was being given and that abortion providers had the information to hand to signpost women to other sources of support. So one of the things that's interesting about abortion compared to other medical procedures is that often the reason that a woman is considering abortion is because of external circumstances and not specifically health related. Now, that's not exclusively true. So the informed consent need not only be about the medical things around the procedure, but about, well, are you having this for financial reasons? Are you aware this financial support's available? Are you aware this housing support's available? Do you need to be directed to a shelter or somewhere that you can get safe from a partner or family member from whom you're at risk? And these are the sorts of things that women really need to be provided with. And if we could be fully satisfied that those things were met, I think you would find that, first of all, I think you'd find that there were fewer abortions, but second of all, I think you'd find that there would be, people would feel less need to have a vigil present there. But the issue of informed consent around abortion is a lot more complicated than it is for a lot of other procedures, which is why I think, I mean, it's such an emotive issue, it's why I think this is a really important conversation about what consent looks like in the context of abortion.
Okay, right, thank you for that.
So,
I'm not sure.
I believe Isabel, Alina and Dr Pickering wish to respond on this point, so maybe invite Isabel first. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just adding to what's been said by Margaret, and in a way to reiterate what Dr. Mark said, that I think it's very hard to find a neutral space on this issue. And even if there were to be some sort of leaflets that everyone had said we were all okay with, we all agree that this presents the issue fairly and gives all the information, even just the way some information is presented cannot be neutral. So I think certainly those who support providing alternatives to abortion would be very concerned about whether neutrality was really happening. And often a lot of the groups who provide help to pregnant women aren't maybe big registered charities or large bodies. I mean, just the organisation I work with is a very small, low-key organisation in a way that just makes sure that whatever anyone needs is provided. And the women that we help are often women who can't recourse to the state, who maybe even sometimes it's people who might be here illegally, who are just really, really struggling, and that there isn't anyone else who can help them with basic help for their baby. These are the sort of women that we might be helping that won't get help from other people, or even if they do get help from other registered bodies, it can take a long time. That's one issue. And I think also, as we've mentioned previously, the people who are outside abortion centres are often there to pray as well. And that's something that even if there were some other help being offered to women inside centres, we would still want to be there to pray about the situation. And that is a very important thing. In fact, I wouldn't want to be handing out information if I wasn't allowed to pray. I think, obviously from a Christian perspective, from a Catholic perspective, prayer has to be coupled with all our work, and being there to be able to pray is very important.
Alina.
So, as one of the many mothers that have been received help and participate in these vigils, I could tell from my own experience and interacting with these mothers in front of abortion facilities, that abortion facilities are extremely biased. I've asked specific help if there's available help there, and they said there's nothing, there's no help, there's no financial help, there's not even someone that can support you emotionally, and they only can offer abortion. And I even called them, asked them help again, and the same answer. I've met mothers that have been coerced into abortion, even jumping windows of abortion because there were stuff they should have reported, but they have not. The parents were forcing an adult woman to take a pill. And so many cases that are not being, let's say, deal with it inside. There's no help. There's no help. And if we have been helped, these vigils have not been helped. Thank you.
Dr. Pickering.
Thank you very much. I think the question asked by the member was about if we could be reassured about the information being provided. There is an excellent way to reassure the different sides about what is being provided, and that is dialogue. And I think we heard earlier from Isabel that where that has been provided, an opportunity, with the police, with the providers, with those who feel compelled either to pray or give information outside, often the providers do not come. There is not a willingness very often from abortion campaigners or providers generally to dialogue. I think all of us represented here, I think, would be very willing to have more dialogue about that. When there was discussion in the Westminster Parliament about how the current government's effect on is the two-child benefit cap. There's certainly concern that some women in England and Wales who are going for abortions are doing that purely because of that benefit cap. And I did reach out to one of the major abortion providers, to their chief executive, and said, look, actually we could work together on this. Here is something that we could go to government about and dialogue with them. And they weren't interested. They responded, they acknowledged it's an issue, but they didn't want to talk to us about it. So there's that real disconnect and distrust. And the way to build that is through better dialogue, through the kind of panels that we've talked about. But I think that really needs two sides of the discussion to want to dialogue as well.
Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Thanks for your evidence so far. I appreciate it. My questions were around human rights considerations, and I think we've exercised quite a bit of that. We'll come back if there's anything further you wish to say. Isabel spoke about her arrest for silent prayer. I wonder if she could describe to committee what exactly happened with that in that situation.
Sure, yeah. Thank you for that opportunity. So I was near the abortion centre, as I've mentioned, for the first arrest. When I was there, I was just standing near the abortion centre, silently saying my prayers, not even manifesting that in any way. And a police officer came and asked me if I was protesting. And I made it clear I wasn't protesting. Asked if I was praying. He had to actually ask me, obviously, because you couldn't tell. And I said I might be in my head, but nothing out loud. And I was arrested on the basis of what I might be praying. And I had to be searched on the street, or I was searched on the street very heavily, which, potentially could be a very humiliating experience, and taken to the police station, locked in a cell for hours before being quizzed about what I was praying about, what I'd been thinking, what was going on in my head. And eventually, as I've described, had to go to court for that and was acquitted. 2 weeks later, I was standing in exactly the same spot, doing exactly the same thing. And this time 6 police officers came in a van and told me my prayers were an offence. When I said I didn't think prayer was offensive, they just became more emphatic and said it is an offence. And again, I was arrested. Put on bail for months after that, and investigated for 6 months. It was a really difficult experience to go through. Obviously, I've highlighted it and publicised it because I think people need to know the reality of what these buffer zones really mean, and to think that we're actually going to criminalise this prayer throughout the country and throughout, well, not just in England and Wales, now in Scotland. I find that really concerning. And like I say, I think it's discriminatory towards people of faith because simply it's just our thoughts directed towards God, but clearly a really serious human rights concern as well, that this is simply our thoughts being censored now.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing that. I wonder if other panel members have any comment on the human rights aspect and balancing rights. As I say, I think we had the opportunity to work some of that out through earlier questioning, but I just wanted to open it up.
Just really, as I was saying, I think just if we could all be cognizant that we are dealing with human rights here. There's human rights in terms of the Universal Declaration, in terms of the European Convention on Human Rights. Those are based specifically the rights to freedom of expression. Freedom of expression includes specifically the right to receive and impart information and ideas, which really is all around this idea of influencing. The right to freedom of association, the right to freedom of thought and conscience, which we said is not balanceable, that's an absolute one. And then also the one is, you'll be aware of, the right to privacy of family life and home life, which would be, there are homes within these buffer zones would be included. So I think, for me, when we use words like rights, we talk about innate, not given or taken away by governments. They're innate, they're to be respected by governments and what they're doing. They are, and we talk about the inalienable. I can't get rid of them myself. Inviolable, no one can take them from me. So I think what that means in private is what I've said. It should be a last resort to take away these or to limit these rights. It should have been established to be necessary. And I think, if I may say so, I think we feel that's why this committee, we would encourage the government to release the rocket science research, because that was objective research that I think the committee could benefit from, because you're faced with a really difficult dilemma here. You need all the help you can get, all the evidence you can get. And there is independent research commissioned by the government. We welcome that the government commissioned this research. That was a really good thing that the government did. Let's try and get some independent and credible research on this. That was good. But we would encourage the government to release it to you so that you have an idea of what's happening, to see, is it really necessary? Now, again, I would say the police don't think it is, that it's proportionate as well if you're taking away or limiting a right, and minimally proportionate. You do only the very least that you have to do in order to preserve the right. And then, as I say, once the issue is passed, there's a facility that then any restriction is taken away. Now, that's why, I'm perhaps anticipating what will be said next, but that's why those who are concerned about human rights say probably the last thing you want to use the criminal law. That's why, as Mark was saying, we want to use dialogue, other more discreet, collaborative means by which we can all not just balance each other's rights, but understand each other's rights.
Thank you. You referenced it, so you may have seen that last week in questioning Police Scotland, I asked if they would be comfortable in policing people's thoughts in terms of prayer, and clearly they responded they wouldn't, and they wouldn't anticipate asking somebody what they were praying about. Do you think there needs to be a protection within the legislation, should it go ahead, that there is an exemption for silent prayer?
I would say so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Ivan.
Just a couple of points of clarification. Bishop Keenan, you referenced research. I'm assuming that the committee is aware of that and the clerks can provide us with information on that. Yeah, they are nodding in the affirmative. That's good. And my second very quick point of clarification, and sorry if I missed this as well. When you were arrested, did you say that you were carrying no placards or signs or visible information about why you were there, and it was purely on the basis of your silent prayer?
That's correct. Yes, I had no signs, no leaflets. I was simply just standing in a street. But I believe I'm the only person that this has happened to. So,
thank you very much for that clarification.
David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to fellow members. My questions are around criminal offences and penalties. In your view, are offences of a bill suitably clear?
No, they wouldn't be that. And I'm glad that you raised that point. There are a number of issues that we sort of have discussed, but I think I think what you're saying, if I may say so, gets to the heart of it, is that we've spoken about this thing about influencing and what that means. And that just, I think, again, one of the requirements of laws and criminal laws is that they're clear. Citizens are free to go about their business unless there is a justifiable criminal law, and that really should be clear. So I think in terms of the question about influencing, it isn't clear in terms of prayer. What's prayer, and is that a bad influence? That's just not clear at all in our view. There's another thing which hasn't been mentioned, which is that it will require signage. So it seems to us that if there's a 200-metre circumference around, for example, the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, that would really mean that there would have to be signage up all of the way around that says abortion safe access zone. We can't see it in other words. Now, and if someone happens to be in there with a pro-life T-shirt because they bought it at a conference a year ago, and walk in that zone, and walked in between two of these signs, then they're potentially breaking the law. And so inadvertently they can find themselves becoming a criminal. So I think clarity is a big concern, all right? And in itself, and we're not sure that a bill that talks about zones can adequately go over that difficulty.
And to add an example to what Bishop John just said, I know it was a case in England that somebody having a pro-life bumper sticker on their car that was parked within a PSBO was raised as an issue of concern. And, you know, that wasn't put on intentionally to be parked in that spot. It's just something that they had on their car. So I think that is very important to be aware of. And further to your point, I had raised at an earlier stage of this bill that if somebody is potentially in breach of the criminal law, they need to know that what their action that they're taking is in breach. I think that's very important. And I think this bill is very vague in terms of what would qualify as a breach of the legislation. And I think that is unfair on citizens. And I think that it's very important that clarity is put in. I was told in answer that it was important that the bill capture a wide range of activities that we might not anticipate. And I thought, well, people need to know if they're breaking the law. I think that's quite plain. And I think that the same would be true for this piece of legislation.
Pickering also wanted to come in. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, the question was also around signage. I think we need absolute clarity on publicly on what can and can't be done within that zone. And I give the example of how I understand bylaws in Scotland can prevent the consumption of alcohol in certain public places. In order to make that effective, you'd need to have signs up saying here are things that are normally legal, but you cannot do them in this zone. So that would be absolutely necessary for clarity. But then it would also highlight the problem to women coming in to that abortion clinic. They would need to know you are now entering the abortion safe access zone. That in itself may produce feelings of distress in the women because it highlights the fact that they are doing something that some people might want to protest about, and they need a law to ban that. And so it would actually be counterproductive whilst bringing clarity on what the bill was.
Answer. The bill would create an offence relating to behaviour from property within safe access zones, which could be seen or heard. What is your opinion about these safe access zones in these properties? And I'm going to include churches which could be in these safe access zones.
Yes, again, thank you for raising that point, because this is what happens when you have a measuring tape approach to this, as we understand. But 200 metres round the Queen Elizabeth or the Chalmers Centre in Edinburgh would take in bus stops, it would take in churches, it would take in schools, it would take in a convent. Now, so it just, when you have it would take in private residences. So someone who might be, as Margaret was saying, someone might be just pro-life and be pretty, committed to it, and might have always had a little sign in their window. But now, once you create a zone, then someone complains about it or raises an incident, the police will have to go and knock on that person's door and ask them to justify why they have this I am pro-life sticker on their window, transfer on their window. It would inevitably mean that. Once you start to have measured zones, and remember that the bill has unlimited scope for, I think as Emma Harper was mentioning, it would have counselling services, it would involve medical centres, it would maybe involve pharmacies, things like that. So the idea to have signage around all of Scotland and all of these, potentially, because the bill doesn't say that can't happen, it would mean half of Scotland is potentially could become a safe access zone, and anyone within it could be potentially and inadvertently criminalised, which is why we would say again that there's a wisdom in the laws that are already there, because they try to balance rights, as Ross Greer was saying, but in a way that doesn't require a measuring tape to be part of the police kit. It just requires them to use their discretion, and as was proposed again when it's about human rights and just about the common good and collaboration and cohabitation in society, dialogue, that facilities that maybe are part of a local authority provision when applying for licences, that part of that will be who are all the stakeholders in this. Let's have a requirement that they get around the table. We think that's a better way of doing it. We just see too many, unlimited and unpalatable and maybe even unworkable consequences from measured no-go areas.
Yeah. Isabel.
Thank you. Yeah, the fact that there's even a possibility of these zones extending into either private dwellings or churches in the area, that's a big worry. I mean, churches have been around a lot longer than legalised abortion, and the fact that we should even want to censor what goes on inside them or outside them, it just shouldn't even be up for question. I mean, certainly from a Catholic Church perspective and from many Christian churches, being pro-life and being opposed to abortion is a really essential part of their teaching. But just coming back to the previous point that was being discussed, I do think it's very worrying that we've got the word influence even being discussed as a word suitable for something within the law. I think it just leaves a door open for really concerning scenarios. Are we going to criminalise a loving mother who just happens to be talking to her daughter on the way to the abortion centre saying, do you know that me and your father would happily help you look after this new child, or something like that? Just like really everyday family conversations that might be happening that could suddenly be viewed in a different light because of how we look at the word influence. And like I say, people end up becoming criminals without even realising that what they're doing could possibly have that, implication. And really based off what? We had an in-depth review of what happened around abortion centres with Sajid Javid in 2018, and he concluded that buffer zones were not a proportionate response. The government hasn't released the research by Rocket Science, as has been described. So really, this is just being effectively based on hearsay, because there's been no evidence of harassment or intimidation around abortion centres. So yeah, I just find that all very concerning.
Thanks very much. We're 10 seconds left, but a very quick supplementary from Dr. Kalahani. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and I will be quick. Bishop John, you've handed me these leaflets. This leaflet, and look, I'm a doctor. Facts really matter. There is really concerning misinformation on this leaflet. 1 in 17 women end up in hospital. 100 abortions fail. Evidence suggests that abortion may increase the risk of breast cancer. I could go on with this leaflet. Again, it talks about breast cancer on this leaflet. This leaflet is factually incorrect with what it's showing, and I've Googled the number that we have here, and one of the things on the website says, with God's help, they have closed 100 abortion centres. Do you feel, given what I've said, and you might disagree if they're factually correct or not, but do you think that this is acceptable?
So, that was the point I was making. I think that's why it's important that we have this rocket science research available to you, because the reason I sourced that for you is because it was led in evidence that these leaflets are given out in Scotland. They're not given out in Scotland. So I think that's important for you to know. Secondly, this has come up because there's been dialogue. Right, I've handed you those leaflets. You've said to me there are things which I find concerning or inaccurate. If that had been the culture that we are proposing here, those sorts of things would happen in the meetings where the kind of the mediation meetings that we are suggesting. There's someone from the hospital, someone from yourself can say, these are things which we think are not accurate and therefore need to be changed, or these are things which are concerning. And have a dialogue about it, which means the end result is that those who might have that sort of information are better informed as far as everyone's concerned.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. We're right out of time, but I really appreciate the witnesses for staying longer. I think it was a worthwhile exercise. And just again, we will probably follow up with written correspondence if there's any additional information that you'd like to share with us in our scrutiny of the bill. Thank you very much. And we'll now suspend the meeting briefly to allow for a changeover of witnesses. So we're just going to resume our scrutiny of the bill. We'll continue with a second evidence session on the Abortion Services Safe Access Zone Scotland Bill. This session will explore human rights considerations, and I welcome to the meeting Ailey Dixon, who's attending virtually, and all others, I believe, are here in person. Reverend Stephen Allison, the Public Engagement Coordinator for the Free Church of Scotland. Ailey Dixon, who's online, of course, Policy and International Officer, Scottish Human Rights Commission. Rob Gowans, Policy and Public Affairs Manager for the Health and Social Care Alliance Scotland, known as the Alliance, and Dr Katrina McMillan, former convener of the Health and Medical Law Subcommittee of the Law Society of Scotland. We will move straight to questions from members, and I invite Ivan McKee to start.
Thanks, convener. Good morning, panel. It's still morning, a long session this morning, but it's still morning. Thanks very much for coming in. The issues I'd like to explore around about balancing human rights. It's a very important part of the consideration. And the first issue, referencing submission from the Scottish Human Rights Commission, described the task of balancing the rights in the ECHR in the context of this bill as challenging. So I'd like to explore your thinking around about that. And then if there are changes to the bill or other steps that you think will be required to make the bill human rights compliant, or more likely to make it human rights compliant. So I don't know, maybe Ailey, do you want to kind of lead off on that, and then we'll go from there? Thanks very much.
Thank you and good morning. I'm really pleased to be here, and I just wanted to reflect that I've watched all of the previous sessions that the committee's had access to over the last couple of weeks and found them really helpful and informative. And that is relevant because a key part of the proportionality assessment that Parliament will have to do is the balancing of competing interests in this case. Between people who wish to hold protests or vigils or assemble in some other means outside of a premise that provides termination of pregnancy services, and people who access those termination of pregnancy services for their own healthcare reasons as prescribed by law. And as well as people who work in those settings, and in addition, people who accompany someone who's attending a clinic for the medical procedure of termination of pregnancy or related information that may be provided. So the committee is well aware that we're primarily talking about qualified rights here, predominantly Article 8 on the part of those who wish to seek termination of pregnancy or provide termination of pregnancy as part of their work, and the Article 9, 10 and 11 rights to greater or lesser extents of the protesters. That's not only the rights that are relevant, there are rights beyond the European Convention that may be relevant, and in some very, very edge cases there may be other absolute rights at play, but predominantly we're talking about a balancing exercise between the Article 8 rights of some users and the 9, 10, 11 rights of the other users. We described that process as challenging because these are very, very important rights. They're not something that can be qualified on a whim. They have to be justified, but it is entirely appropriate for a justification to be pursued by Parliament. We are also fortunate that the Supreme Court has now considered the legislation in Northern Ireland, which gives us a really good foundation to move. And in fact, the Supreme Court was really conscious in its review of the Northern Ireland legislation that the Scottish Parliament was considering its own legislation in this space, and that is referenced throughout the proceedings at the Supreme Court. Obviously, the Lord Advocate in Scotland took the case on a public interest ground. It's also referenced in the judgment. So we can use the judgment really, really helpfully to clarify some of the considerations. However, there are competing interests that the committee has to hear, and that's why the value of the evidence, the scale of the evidence that's before the committee will be really, really helpful in that regard. In general, qualified rights such as 9, 10 and 11 can be restricted by a general measure of Parliament. We know that that's the case from case law at Strasbourg and domestically. Even where in some cases that would create edge cases or hard cases where a more detailed proportionality assessment needs to be done. So a general measure is allowed, and that would include, in this case, the introduction of the criminal sanctions and the introduction of the safe access zones. When determining whether something is a proportionate justification, a justified and proportionate restriction of a 9, 10 and 11 right, the court gives us quite a clear framework for how to do that, and we will probably discuss elements of it. But essentially, we can kind of describe that. Does the relevant clause restrict the rights that are protected by, in this case, 9, 10, and 11? More or less, we can say yes. There are, again, some instances where they will not be covered by the Convention because of Article 17 of the Convention, which wouldn't protect violent instances of expression, for example. There is some conflicting case law about whether Article 9 is necessarily engaged. But broadly, we can say 9, 10, and 11 are engaged. Then is that restriction prescribed by law? And that means that it has to be either in common law or in the statute as you're pursuing through the bill. And is it clear and able to be understood? And again, we may pick up on some of those themes. Does the restriction pursue a legitimate aim? The Supreme Court decision on the Northern Ireland legislation is really clear here, and really helpfully articulates that with some clarity that the purpose of protecting women who are seeking termination of pregnancy is a legitimate aim. And then the next question is whether the restriction is necessary in a democratic society, and this includes, again, subtests, which include, is the aim sufficiently important to justify the interference with the fundamental rights in 9, 10, and 11? Is there a rational connection between the means pursued and the aim that Parliament is trying to pursue? And are there less restrictive alternative means that may achieve the aim and actually achieve the aim? Not maybe in some cases, obviously the least restrictive means will be doing nothing, but would that actually achieve the aim? And you go through the options like that. And the Supreme Court has done that with very similar legislation, so we can answer some of those questions with some certainty, although there were some elements of the bill that Parliament needs to consider. I think, again, it's worth stressing that this is ultimately a parliamentary decision about weighing up all of the conflicting factors on the bill as a whole, and that's why the level of evidence that Parliament's received is so vitally important in doing that, and that there will probably be some edge cases if legislation is pursued, even if there were some amendments to some of the perhaps more uncertain elements. The Supreme Court is really useful in clarifying, again, that police will have to do that proportionality assessment on case-by-case basis. Courts will have to do that proportionality assessment if it reaches that point. That a certain level of fine may be disproportionate. So we're not able to say in absolute that every single case will be proportionate, but the legislation as a whole seems on balance to consider at least all of these options, and it's perfectly within Parliament's discretion to be able to do that.
Thank you very much. There's a lot there, and I'd like to come back on some points of it, but other members of the panel an opportunity to comment on any of that initially. Stephen, yeah.
Thank you. It is a very challenging area to balance these different rights, and there's a lot of detail that needs to be considered. And I suppose, coming back specifically on what's just been raised in relation to the Northern Irish Supreme Court decision, I think it is important to recognise the areas where the legislation before the Scottish Parliament is not completely identical with the Northern Irish legislation, and some of those factors, I think, should be given serious consideration by the committee. First of all, the context in Northern Ireland is different because of the recent changes to abortion law in Northern Ireland, and particular evidence that seems to have been found in the international rights agencies that went in of a significant pressing social concern. And I'm not convinced there's the same level of evidence in Scotland for that issue. Obviously, you've heard evidence from those who do engage in these kind of protests. The Free Church of Scotland as a whole don't. But we are concerned about the broader human rights considerations of this legislation. So the context is different. The distance is much greater in Scotland than what was proposed in Northern Ireland. 200 metres, double the length of Murrayfield, is quite an extensive area. It was 100 metres with the option of 150 extension in Northern Ireland. The provision for unlimited extension without an upper limit is quite concerning to us, as actually that is quite a broad power which has no real limitations on it. Potentially, I suppose, you could apply for judicial review of that kind of decision, but that's putting an ordinary citizen at a huge court expense to do that. And I think it would be better if there was more clarity in the legislation. Also, the specific provisions in the Scottish legislation about private property are something that I think needs to be looked into in a lot of detail. So there are a number of areas where we're not on a complete par with the Supreme Court decision, and that's why I think more should be discussed about some of those areas. Thanks.
That's hugely helpful. Thank you very much. Rob?
Yeah, I think it's. I think there's a beating balance of rights, and I think there's. I think probably in our view, firstly that sort of abortion is healthcare, and that a person's choice to have or not to have an abortion must be voluntary, and decision to do so may not be voluntary if it's coerced or unduly influenced by demonstrators, and it would be important for anybody's ability to enjoy their sort of right to health, to be able to access a healthcare facility without intimidation. And we know from evidence from Chalmers Sexual Health Centre that 56% of people felt very uncomfortable attending if there were protesters present. And we also know from work on the right to health and a sort of research that we did in terms of investigating people's knowledge and understanding of the right to health, that stigma and discrimination can act as a barrier when people are trying to access information about their rights, and negative experiences of health services can play into that. We acknowledge there's a delicate sort of balancing act that maintains people's right to privacy, right to health, right to freedom of expression. However, in line with the kind of legal and sort of policy precedents, as I think that Bailey Dixon has referred to, and the UK Supreme Court's decision, it feel that the balance has been met, and that it would be a sort of proportional restriction on sort of people's rights.
Thank you. Katrina?
Yeah, so just to add to that, really, what we would underline is that the government needs to meet both of these tests. First, that it needs to meet a legitimate aim. And as has already been raised, the Supreme Court has held that this would be a legitimate aim. And the other thing is that it needs to be proportionate. And both of these tests need to be met in order to be compliant with human rights law and prevent the bill from being, or eventual legislation from being open to challenge. So to go through a number of things that have been taken into account with regards to that kind of balancing exercise, a lot of this actually, was all raised in this case on the Northern Ireland legislation. Member states are under a positive obligation where they do have legislation for provision of abortion services to provide a procedural framework to effectively enable access to those abortion services. Things that have been accounted for in case law on this are, in terms of the Article 8 rights of women and healthcare professionals going into buildings, regardless of what they're doing there, are things such as adverse health consequences, mental health effects as well. Something else that we drew attention to in our response is Article 8 rights of those working there, so their right to access their working conditions in privacy and dignity. And these, of course, all have to be balanced with while Article 8 is a qualified right, these all have to be balanced with Articles 9, 10 and 11, as you've all heard. And so while broadly speaking, the legislation is in many ways similar to legislation that has been held to be human rights compliant with the Supreme Court, there's a few things that we highlight that might be worth review in terms of proportionality to make sure that it's not open to challenge. There was a comment there, I'm sure we'll come back to this, there was a comment there on the size of buffer zones, something that we noted in our response. While the initial size of buffer zones is larger than the ones provided for in the Northern Irish legislation, in the Supreme Court review of the legislation, they actually noted that even a zone of up to 250 metres, they specifically said it wouldn't be an unjustifiable restriction on the rights of protesters.
Thank you very much. One of the issues clearly we've heard the evidence on this morning and previously is round about the issue of silent prayer, and bearing in mind that the Northern Ireland experience and the Supreme Court ruling, but also taking on board the evidence we heard this morning that I'm sure you heard round about the woman that was arrested for praying silently with no other visible signage or anything to connect her to any protest or anything, and the interaction with the police that took place there, and obviously the evidence we took with it from the Police Scotland in this regard earlier. Now, I don't know to what extent you can or can't comment on individual cases, but it's certainly either that or in the generality. Is there a danger that while a ruling may say one thing with regard to that, it ends up being in a different place when the practicality of how that's implemented on the ground is taken forward? Or any other comments you've got with regards to that very pertinent issue around about the right to silent prayer, the ECHR rights on that, and how that applies in the legislation in the Supreme Court ruling? Katrina, thanks.
Yeah. So generally, this is one of the specific issues that obviously has come up as being quite difficult with regards to measuring proportionality. One of the things that I think is quite dependent on the definition of silent prayer and what silent prayer activity includes. If it can be, for example, what was mentioned earlier, just standing there basically, right through to definitions of silent prayer have also included things such as signage. And the important thing, I think, to highlight from a legal perspective is while freedom of thought is indeed an absolute right, freedom to manifest religion is not actually an absolute right. And so there is a degree of scrutiny required, I think, on the ins and outs of where that boundary is with regards to silent prayer. But it's something that the Law Society wants to develop a position on and can get back to you after the meeting about.
Ailey Dixon wants to come back in. Ailey?
Yeah, thank you. And I think I mostly agree with Katrina on that point. I think I can't speak to the specific instances, but in general terms, it's absolutely right that Article 9 protects what happens inside one's head to an absolute. You can't restrict that. And so I think the evidence that we heard Police Scotland last week about how they envision being able to judge whether silent prayer is actually happening was really helpful, but also I think raises some challenges as Katrina sort of highlights there. The first thing I think is obviously the appropriateness with which Police Scotland could ask someone what's going on in their head, but also then what sort of evidence would be required to deduce that somebody was engaging in silent prayer with the purpose of or reckless to the consequence of someone who was seeking abortion or providing abortion services. So you would be having to look at things like the presence of religious artifacts or signage or things they were saying out loud, even if that was not related to prayer. So it would be a bit of a challenge, and there would have to be that proportionality assessment in every case as well as in the general rule. Police and courts are both subject to Section 6 of the Human Rights Act, which would require them to comply in not only how they understand the legislation, but how they enforce that legislation. And you would expect that to be the case. And I think that spoke quite significantly to what Police Scotland was saying last week. I just wanted to pick up on a sort of related theme, which is this distinction between silent prayer and protest. And I think that's a bit of a challenging one when we look at it purely from the Convention on Human Rights, because actually we're talking about the freedom of expression and the freedom of assembly, and what one person might regard as being a vigil might be regarded as a protest by another person, and the legislation doesn't seek to draw that line anywhere. It seeks to kind of cover the manifestations of those two rights in particular. So it's a little bit of a tricky one to actually understand. Well, what we would be talking about actually in relation to silent prayer is what evidence is there that suggests somebody is doing something with the purpose of influencing somebody else in the safe access zone. It wouldn't actually be an offence, I think, or certainly their Article 9 rights would protect them from any interrogation about what they think. So if someone is walking through a safe access zone with no visible, religious or political affiliation visible on them, we can't judge what's going on inside their head. You would have to look for some evidence of there being an intention for that prayer to be heard by others, or maybe not heard, but picked up by somebody else.
Sorry, Stephen.
Thank you. This issue over private prayer is one of the ones that obviously deeply concerns us as a church, and the precedent this is setting, and whether or not that obviously could be extended to other areas. I think it raises this huge issue about the kind of grey areas of the legislation, and I think that was just raised by Ailey about the question of, is prayer influencing someone if it's private prayer in a certain context? And I think that is crossing a line into areas that are deeply personal. Like, I heard some of the discussion in the previous session about the nature of prayer, place and presence and all of that. But actually, prayer is deeply personal to individuals as to how they feel called to pray in certain areas. Some people may do that in public, some may not. And I think we're getting into quite a difficult area with us trying to make law about theology and about specifically telling people this kind of religious practice is acceptable in this area but not this area. And so prayer kind of opens up a whole area of concern for us about what is the intention of this legislation. Does that amount to influencing or not? Religious symbols are connected to that, obviously, and even issues of religious symbols that are not necessarily about pro-life, but actually just religious symbols can be perceived as connected to this issue, because obviously we all know the vast majority of those engaged in this kind of behaviour are coming from a religious perspective. And so any religious symbols could be seen as influencing someone. So you talk about buildings within the private property area and what could be outside a building. People have talked a lot about a pro-life leaflet or a pro-life poster, or anything like that. What about just general religious leaflets? What about just a message to repent and be forgiven of your sins outside a church? Would that potentially influence someone making a decision on abortion? And I think the answer is it could. And so it's not clear how far this would extend and what are the limits, because the way the legislation has been drafted is deliberately broad to catch as many things as possible.
That's a very interesting point, and I don't recall us having heard that previously in terms of other religious messages that aren't abortion specific, and maybe reflect on that. I suppose just finally, I was just going to drill down a wee bit further on the silent prayer issue. Katrina, you said that the definition of silent prayer can be broad in terms of including other stuff, and I suppose if you parse that out and say, well, if those other activities, signage or audible prayer or other symbols are dealt with in one regard, if you like, but just looking purely at the issue of silent prayer, and certainly the example we heard this morning was in that space where apparently there was no other manifestation to link it to anything else. Is there a risk that that is problematic?
I think there is certainly a risk that including that could be open to challenge on the basis of proportionality. But again, I think that's something that the Law Society have noted they would like to get back to the committee on. Yep.
And I don't know, Ellie, is that anything you want to comment
on? No, I think I've covered it. I mean, I couldn't speak to the specific case and how it was actually handled by the police, but I think my previous remarks speak to the general.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, Reverend Allison.
Sorry, can I just raise something on, I suppose, the specific case that you heard about earlier? My understanding is there wasn't a successful prosecution. There wasn't a conviction for that. But that actually is part of a broader concern that the police did feel the need to bring it. The prosecutors felt the need to bring it, and the effect that has on people who are not guilty of the criminal law. And I heard what the Police Scotland had to say on this point, and I thought it was encouraging that that was the general view of Police Scotland, but individual police officers may ask questions in different ways. And actually, you ask me if I'm praying, I'll say yes if I'm praying, because I believe in being honest to you. If you ask me directly, I don't think I have a right, I need to tell you I'm praying, but if you ask me, I'll tell you. And so I think it is more the chilling effect of threat of prosecution, and actually the follow-up to that was really concerning, where 6 police officers then turned up for the next time. So it's that broader chilling effect, which may not be criminal, but that's the impact of this legislation.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I just ask a quick supplementary on that? It's an interesting point you made. Is it a practical scenario? Do you see, for example, hospital chaplains being potentially impacted by this legislation?
I am quite concerned about that, yes, actually, because of there are obviously exceptions in the legislation about other healthcare workers within the hospital context. There are exceptions about the people who are accompanying someone, who've been asked to accompany someone and are voluntarily doing that. But I do wonder what would happen if someone asked, can I speak to a chaplain? Can I discuss this with a chaplain? Can I go? And would the chaplain be allowed within this legislation to have those discussions within the area about, particularly, like perhaps you asked to speak to a Roman Catholic chaplain or a different chaplain, and they have their own views. Are they healthcare workers in the same sense? So are they covered by the exceptions? I'm not sure, and I think the committee should look into the chaplaincy issue more.
Okay, thank you. Ross Greer.
Thanks, Camilla. Reverend Nelson, I thought the comments you just made there, in part in response to the question I posed in the first session, were really interesting. I agree that in general we shouldn't legislate on the basis of theology, but of course some religious practices are prohibited in law for reasons that we would all generally regard as absolutely justifiable, because it's about balance of rights, protection of vulnerable groups, etc. I suppose I'd be interested in Free Church's perspective on the question that Dr Gohani posed to the last panel of, would you agree that it's unacceptable for protests to take place in proximity to a hospital, to an abortion provider, where there are graphic images on display? Dr Pickering mentioned the previous session, dismembered fetus, etc. I'd be interested in your perspective on that, because given the previous panel, very, very valuable evidence, largely from the perspective of Catholic system of belief. I think it'd be interesting to have yours as well.
Absolutely. And I think on this issue there'll be a lot of overlap with the Catholic Church. When it comes to life issues, we tend to be in the Free Church in agreement with the Catholic Church. There are many practices that we would condemn and say that's not appropriate to do this. We do believe the existing law, threatening abusive behaviour, various breach of the peace, would cover a lot of different issues. I guess when it comes to the specifics of displaying graphic images of dismembered fetuses or anything like that, I would have serious concerns about that, in the same way actually that I would have concerns about you showing pictures of someone who has been murdered by anyone. And so we wouldn't want our news to be broadcasting beheadings. We wouldn't want it to be broadcasting anything horrendous in that kind of level, because of the dignity to the person. And so if I believe that the baby in the womb is a person, then that dignity protection means I don't want to be showing images of a dead person. So I would condemn those kind of practices as out of order, and shouldn't be the nature of these kind of things. As I say, I think there may be individuals in the Free Church who engage in some of this practice, but in the whole, we don't consider this the best way of discussing or engaging in abortion. Our concern is that I wouldn't want to stop someone from doing that. Like, you talk about different readings of the Bible, different readings of prayer. You and I might disagree on aspects of theology, but I wouldn't want the state to come in and decide this is not allowed unless there's a very good reason, such as, I suppose, cruelty to animals and some of the horrendous practices in some religions that we obviously would all agree should be illegal. So there is a balance to be struck, and I think I would, on the whole, agree with what was said in the previous session by the Catholic Church and others about things that we would not condone, that we would actually have just as many concerns about. But this legislation is so broad as to cover any attempts to influence. And I'm very nervous about the idea that we can't persuade, influence, have dialogue. I think that is going too far.
Thanks very much. So just on that, then, this gets us into quite an interesting place because you had a large amount of overlap with what the previous witnesses were saying. And we've heard quite a lot of evidence, a belief that we have existing laws that cover breach of the peace, harassment, etc. The challenge is Parliament has been presented with, it's been well covered in the media, instances where I think what we would, the vast majority of the population would regard as unacceptable behaviour, as harassment and intimidation, has taken place, but the police have felt, under current legislation, unable to intervene. Now, that is, I'm not talking about all of the vigils, protests, prayer groups, etc., that take place, but we have had examples of images being projected onto the wall of the hospital and into the hospital. We've had evidence of incidents outside the Sandyford Clinic in Glasgow where people are using a speaker system so that they are not just harassing people going in, but that the people inside the building can hear them on an ongoing basis as they say very provocative things. The challenge, I think, for the committee here is we need to assess why action hasn't been taken in those instances. Was it because the law as it stands is inadequate, or is there a barrier to enforcing the law as it currently stands? And I'd be interested in Katrina and Ailey's perspective on this, because a lot of these discussions are coming down to this question of how would we inspect this bill to be enforced, and the judgment that would have to be made, like the example that's been given in the previous session of the arrest that, as Reverend Allison said, didn't lead to a conviction. I'd be interested in your perspective on the extent to which this differs from a lot of other areas of law as it stands, where we do expect, in the first instance, the police to make a judgment, and then for the fiscal, obviously, to do so at the next stage, and how much of those concerns could be addressed not on the face of the bill itself, but through guidance, either Lord Advocate guidance or through operational guidance for Police Scotland.
Yeah. So I guess the first thing that we would point to is the evidence given by various stakeholder groups, healthcare practitioners, folk seeking termination, in terms of how effective the current legislative landscape has been in terms of preventing intimidation and harassment. We secondly would also point to the evidence for a real need for this legislation, which is something that's really important in terms of the proportionality assessment. In England, while the upcoming legislation hasn't been tested in court yet, they actually had a legislative landscape that allowed for safe access zones to be enabled. But for various reasons, that's needed to go one step further. For one reason or another, that's not been enough. So what this all kind of tends to suggest is that the landscape that we have at the moment isn't necessarily enough to act in that way. And there are various ways, for example, by putting principles on the face of the legislation, which is one thing that we've recommended, or adding additional guidance, which can help. So, yeah.
Ailey, do you have a perspective on that, and specifically that question of how much, to what extent the concerns around judgment can be addressed through either guidance from the Lord Advocate in terms of prosecution or operational guidance for Police Scotland, and parallels with other areas of law where that's the case?
I think I would just remind the committee of what I previously noted around Section 6 of the Human Rights Act, which requires public bodies and public authorities to exercise all their decision-making in conjunction with the Human Rights Act and the tests that we've outlined previously. So there is a framework within which this happens, and this was discussed at length in the Northern Ireland reference at the Supreme Court. In terms of parallels, I mean, there were many parallels. I don't want to get into that off the top of my head, but that general safeguard of Section 6 applies to all. And prosecutors, and I think the committee would be better to get an answer from Scottish Government about how they want prosecutors to kind of handle some of those decision-making, and how they will work with them to make sure that is exercised in a way that is proportionate and does this balancing test appropriately. Obviously, the clearer things are on the face of the legislation, the less room there is for hard cases. But also the level of discretion can also be helpful. So it's a judgment call really for the committee to make about the extent to which you want to be incredibly precise, and the extent to which you want to allow for some interpretation as novel ways of manifesting expression or assembly or religious belief in a way that is harmful to people who are trying to access termination of pregnancy or is perceived to be harmful is managed.
Thanks, Arch. Thanks, all.
Emma Harper.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning to you. I'm interested in just pursuing questions around the definition of protected premises within the bill, because I know there's a future-proofing aspect of it that might then include GP practices, pharmacies down the line. So I'm interested, basically, what you think about the definition or the meaning of protected premises.
Yeah, so I'm sure you're all aware that the way in which abortion care is being delivered in Scotland and elsewhere has changed a lot in recent years. And so our view, I mean, to be concise, is that the proposed definition and the scope to modify included in there is appropriate, partly because the landscape is changing with regards to abortion care and the legislation surrounding that, but also to enable cessation where, for example, it's no longer provided at a particular premise.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Ailey Norden.
Yeah. I'm happy to, although I don't think I have much to disagree with the previous answer on. There does need to be some flexibility given the speed at which things are changing. Safeguards around those determinations could be put onto the face of the legislation around the requirement to consult or the requirement to undertake the fair balance test. And also, I think we'll come on to it, but the zone and how the zone is defined there may need to be some discussion about variability depending on the types of premises that are added. But I think it's perfectly acceptable to have some degree of future proofing.
With that then, Ailey, in the allowing flexibility for 200 metres to be less or more or extended, expanded, depending on where healthcare is provided. Last week we heard that the Chalmers is next to a high school, for instance. So in an urban area it might be different than somewhere where, like, I know that Dumfries and Galloway Royal Infirmary is pretty rural and they've got more than 200 metres from the edge of the perimeter of the campus right up to the front door, and there's two front doors, one for midwifery maternity and one for main like general I suppose visits. So what are your thoughts around the issue around 200 metre zone or the ability to extend up, down, change it, map it, pretty much depending on where the healthcare facility is located?
Would you like me to start with that?
Sure.
Sure. Oh, okay. So the Commission doesn't and has not said a particular preference for a particular size of zone. We do note and continue to note that the zone proposed in the bill now has increased in size from what was consulted on, and is larger than comparable jurisdictions in Northern Ireland and England and Wales. There may be very good reason for that. I'm not sure, and I apologise, I've not read every single submission, but there may be very good reasons for that, but it would be helpful to be really, really clear about the necessity of that extension, specifically within Scotland. I have heard some description that it could be to do with the particular needs at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, in which case there is perhaps an open question about whether it's better to set a lower default with the capability of extending it to meet that particular need, if that is deemed to be unnecessary elsewhere, that 200 metres is deemed to be necessary for one premise and not for others. So I think it's something that needs to be looked at completely in the round. And as I think Stephen noted earlier, it is one of the areas that is different to the Northern Ireland legislation, as well as the context and how healthcare is delivered is very different. Termination of pregnancy healthcare in particular is delivered in Scotland is very different to England and Wales. So there are not perfect parallels to be drawn here. It has to be considered in the round. I'll just add that I think reading through the bill, I think some of the particular processes around extension and reduction do perhaps leave open the opportunity for a future government to introduce the 200, or for the 200 metre zone to be introduced by default, and then that to be restricted to 0, because there's no lower limit, but there's also no upper limit. That decision taken by a minister would obviously, to my mind, be judicially reviewable under the Human Rights Act, because it would require ministerial discretion. So there would be that opportunity for review. But I think it's, as Stephen has noted and others have noted, that the likelihood of taking a judicial review case in those cases would be quite challenging. So I do think that's an area that the committee may wish to look at in some detail, about the necessity of the 200 metres, why that departure is justified. It may well be, and as Katrina noted, the Supreme Court didn't say when they looked at the Northern Ireland that 250 metres would necessarily be disproportionate. In some cases, that might be entirely reasonable. But yeah, what's the default? What's necessary for everyone? And then how is that expanded or reduced? And what are the limits on that power? Are the critical points.
I think Stephen had.
Yeah, so we've obviously raised concerns about the 200 metres. We also noted that had increased from the previous consultative proposals, which, given there was maybe a lot less responses to the call for views from the previous consultation, that is concerning that that's jumped without really people engaging with that. 200 metres internationally is greater than, I think, just about every jurisdiction that has done something like this. And the Supreme Court did talk about 250 being proportionate in some cases, but that's where there's obviously been a decision to extend the 100 metres to 150 by 150 metres because of some reason. I guess I'm quite concerned that most of the discussion has been about the Queen Elizabeth Hospital and the needs there, rather than what's needed for all of Scotland, because this is a blanket proposal. And actually a lower starting point would be, if you're going to go down this, preferable, although we don't think this is the most appropriate approach. I also do think some of the concerns that have been raised about high school near Chalmers and all of that is concerning, about what may influence someone that are legitimate activities to take place in a school. What if there was a debating society? What if there was a class discussing these issues, knowing that there are people in the class who maybe are wrestling with some of these issues? That could be influencing people. And I don't think we want school pupils not to be able to engage in those discussions. So there's a lot more nuance needed. And I think in general, this legislation is a very hard instrument that says this is quite broad deliberately. I think more nuance is needed about a lot of the details, and the distance needed in certain areas, whether or not there are some areas that actually don't need safe access zones. Are you, in some cases, drawing attention to the fact in a local context that someone's going for an abortion in a normal hospital where people are not really thinking that's what people are doing here, and actually you're therefore raising that issue in people's minds? Oh, maybe that's why that person's going in there. It's not. I think there are a lot of difficult concerns in practice that have to be thought about.
My final question about how would we communicate to the public then that a safe zone exists? So that's kind of like what you're saying, bringing attention to an area that is providing healthcare for women. Like signage came up, for instance. What are your thoughts around how do we communicate to the public about behaviours and then the zones?
I think that is really difficult, because I don't think we can necessarily be clear as to what is and is not permitted in these areas. Like, it's actually not we are worried about private prayer, exclusively private prayer. It's not necessarily clear that would influence someone. Would you really want to raise that on what is and isn't allowed in any signage? I think this is a really difficult, and actually it's why I do think existing legislation is sufficient, and if it's not sufficient, you could extend existing provisions where it is responsive to a problem that arises, where an assessment is made that there is an issue in it. So a protest being hijacked by two individuals who come up with loudspeakers and start speaking very loudly or projecting images. If they're hijacking a protest, the police could make a decision in that case, and maybe you need to extend some of the existing provisions to make it clear it would cover that kind of thing. But the blanket approach, I think, is really difficult to communicate to the wider public.
Yeah, I suppose on those points, don't have anything particularly on signage as such, I think in terms of the sort of the 200 metres, I think we would be, I think that would be sort of appropriate as a distance based on the kind of the geography of the sites, because I think this was referred to in earlier in Scotland there isn't sort of standalone Linux, so they're generally larger sites, and I think we've heard from particularly from BPAS and sort of back of Scotland around particularly the geography of the Glasgow site and the need for sort of national consistency. I think there's, in terms of protected premises, I think we agree with sort of part of the legislation, but there's potential that the sort of the power to sort of require changes to be made by sort of regulations would be would be welcome to sort of strengthen that. But I think it's important that that it is sort of future proofed and sort of could be added, and but that sort of regulations could be scrutinised by Parliament at that point. I think in terms of where sort of some of the one of the things that we considered was sort of bus stops and public transport hubs, and that, for instance, people may then sort of protest outside the hospital, start congregating around the bus stop and protesting there. So there's the potential for I think probably there's what we'd recommend is that there's sort of post-legislative scrutiny undertaken of the Act once it's been in operation, and see what's changed in practice, whether there are we can sort of get some of the sort of other cases, and whether sort of some of the sort of legislation needs to be changed to reflect the sort of the different circumstances around facilities in Scotland.
Okay, thanks.
David Torrance.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, thank you. I just wanted to add off the back of those discussions about the size of zones and signage. First, with regards to the size of zones, similar to Ailey's comments, Law Society don't have a specific position on how big the zone should be, other than the size of zones should be informed by evidence. And that's important again with regards to making sure that the legislation is proportionate. The other thing that we highlighted in our response, and something I want to draw to your attention, is both the unlimited scope for reduction and the unlimited scope for extension. With regards to reduction, our point really was that having unlimited scope for that might actually have the potential to undermine the very purpose of the bill. And on the other end, with extension, our concern might be that it could possibly be open to challenge on the basis of human rights if there's unlimited scope for extension. So something that we've recommended is that there's reasonable limits placed on both the minimum and maximum zones, informed by evidence such as other jurisdictions, such as evidence gathered by stakeholders, in order to prove that it really is necessary, which evidence does seem to suggest. In terms of signage, that's something that we have commented that ideally we feel is important to have, that the zones are clearly marked, so folk know that they're entering a zone where they cannot protest.
David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to witnesses. The bill would create an offence relating to behaviour for property within the safe access zones, which could be seen or heard, and we heard in the last evidence sessions that it could cover churches. Do you have any concerns about the extent of the offences and whether it complies with the European Convention on Human Rights then?
Yeah, I'll come in if that's okay. So in terms of the offences, generally what we've said is Section 4, we're quite happy that these are in line with precedent set by English case law, the Supreme Court judgments, so on and so forth. Something we did raise concern with is the offence in Section 5, and the thing that you raised there with the range of activities could be visible and audible from perhaps, it seems, an indefinite perimeter. And again, kind of going back to my point about ensuring that the legislation isn't open to challenge, We think it's quite important that there is an objective and verifiable radius in which forbidden activities are restricted is made very clear, and with a view to making sure that the legislation is proportionate.
So I suppose I would go back to what I already mentioned in relation to, because of the lack of clarity as to what kind of behaviour this could cover, there are questions over will this go into other areas of rights. Other examples that someone gave me was what about during a political election process, if certain candidates or parties were putting forward a particular position in relation to pro-life, would that stop those posters being displayed from a private property where it can be seen? I do think there's issues over religious symbolism and how that symbolism is perceived by people. And I guess in general that comes down to a lot of this verges into subjective perception influencing. Like, what influences you might not be what influences someone else. And I think we have to be quite concerned with that. Like, actually, a lot of posters, Christian communication stuff will impact different people based on your upbringing, based on what you've experienced in life. And so we have to, I think it's very hard to know what may or may not be caught by this, particularly when some of the public some of the buildings could be churches and other spaces. So I think a lot of concern is around that, and as I said previously, that's not covered by the Northern Irish Supreme Court decision, so it could be an area of real challenge where where a church could be concerned about that, depending on where they're based.
Dixon, what's to come in?
Just briefly to say, agree with Katrina broadly and Stephen's kind of overall perception of that. I think it's worth just drawing attention to Section 4, broadly similar to what has already been tested in relation to the Northern Ireland comparable provisions. But the Section 5 or the Clause 5 offence, the offence of influencing, preventing access to or causing harassment in an area visible or audible from a safe access zone. Audible, obviously, it's where we run into some problems around signage and scope, what is audible in the safe access zone and how far away that might be. I think that we didn't go into this in our submission, but it's worth highlighting that both offences can be committed with the intention to influence or that somebody is reckless to. I think there's an open question for the committee about whether that is appropriate for both offences equally. We don't have a view on that, but it's worth just flagging that there may be a difference between someone who does something from a private property with the intention of influencing or otherwise preventing or harassing, whereas somebody who conducts something in their private home that has the unintended consequence of doing that, there may be a different test to apply. That may be where the committee wishes to look further.
The fines that will be imposed for breaching the conditions in the safe access zones, do you think they're, should I say, because appropriate, because many of the fines will be paid by well-funded anti-abortion campaigners, so will they have the effect of stopping the activity in these areas? Or, under human rights, is prison sentences appropriate if it's continued offences?
What we would say is this seems to be, in terms of the fine aspect, it's in line with other jurisdictions. We note that Northern Ireland have a limit of, I think, £500. I might be wrong on that. But generally, we don't have a particular position otherwise, other than it's clearly in line with other jurisdictions. Yeah.
Yes, we would feel the penalties are sort of appropriate, and that the kind of level of sanction and penalty are a sort of matter to sort of courts to decide on a sort of case by case basis, and that would be sort of captured within the bill. So, for instance, if there's sort of repeat offending activities which amount to physical or mental harm, and situations where people's intent was to sort of get arrested and have their fine paid by by another, or not to pay the fine in an attempt to get imprisoned. To highlight, I think that can be sort of determined by the courts, and would be happy with that part of the bill.
Ailey Dixon, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thank you. So the provision on sanctions in the Act is, as others have noted, considerably higher as the maximum penalty than the legislation in Northern Ireland. We didn't look at this in any great detail in the evidence we submitted to the committee, but in our initial consultation response, we did look at sanctions quite carefully and reflected that there's quite a broad range of possible sanctions in comparable legislation. So the French law on this is not exactly similar. It doesn't relate to a termination of pregnancy sites, but it does relate to the attempts to prevent the practice of interruption of pregnancy by outside of particular disrupting access to establishments is the language that they use in France, and their law has a maximum of €30,000 and 2 years imprisonment, and that was the highest I found, certainly. So there does seem to be a big spectrum. I think perhaps the issue here, one Rob has outlined carefully, is people who may choose not to pay a fine in order to receive a prison sentence, and therefore perhaps demonstrate or highlight their concern about the way in which the bill is being implemented if it became law. And the other is it would be useful, I think, for somebody from the executive to set out what they expect the fines will be. We would expect them to be considerably lower than the 10,000. That provision is common across Scottish legislation about what a fine looks like. So it's not directly about this legislation. It's just the sort of standard default. But what would they be expecting the fine to be in these sorts of circumstances?
Okay, Ruth McGuire.
Thank you, convener. Good morning. Thanks for being with us. I'd like to ask folks' views on if they feel or organisations feel there might be wider implications for other places or types of protest. Stephen is here now.
Yeah, so this was one of our biggest concerns about the legislation that we highlighted in our response. Abortion is a contested issue in society. It's an issue where a lot of pressure is already applied to people not to speak about these issues. So one of the ways the Free Church responds to these consultations is I actually invite members of the Free Church in a variety of professional contexts to meet with me and discuss the proposal, and then I prepare a response. I do these sessions, the people I meet with are anonymous, and actually this is one issue where they would have to be anonymous to meet with me and talk to me about it. In fact, I think just about everyone I spoke to who, other than, I suppose, ministers, but people who I spoke to who were women involved in the legal profession, in other professions, in the healthcare profession, and in counselling, felt they could not speak publicly in relation to this bill. They were very concerned about speaking publicly. I know there was an organisation set up to try and oppose this, and only one of the five people who set it up felt they could speak publicly because of what they did. And so there is already an issue, and it's got worse in Scotland since Roe versus Wade in the United States, which isn't really relevant here in the same way. But suddenly abortion has become an even more difficult issue for people to talk about in a professional context that obviously I can talk about as a minister because my employer doesn't care, but a lot of other people are concerned about this. And I suppose, so there's that chilling effect and the symbolism of kind of anti-abortion views being wrong, but I do feel that could be applied to other contested areas, other areas where there are differences of opinions. Like we have many areas I'm sure you would disagree with us on in the church, but part of our freedom of speech is to be able to talk about it, dialogue about it, discuss it. And I feel that you are setting a precedent here of saying this particular thing is out of order in this particular place, and maybe other things could be out of order in other places in the future, and this could become the precedent for other attempts to do legislation in a whole host of areas. And so we do fear this kind of because of the language of persuading and influencing, which we think are quite helpful language, we do seek to persuade people of our beliefs. We do seek to call people to follow our beliefs. They can reject that, they can say what they like in response, but we do fear there is you're crossing dangerous ground here by pushing in this area. Abortion might be the accepted norm in society today. What if other things also become the accepted norm in the future?
Thank you. Can I ask Ailey Dixon that same question?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I'll start by saying I've not seen any evidence or any intention by anybody to produce similar restrictions around other premises. So we would be speaking in the abstract. It's not, of course, impossible or without precedent. So Canada, I'm aware, they've had buffer zones in parts of Canada around abortion clinics for many years. And then there was some discussion whether it happened or not about replicating those for COVID vaccine premises. But that was obviously in the context of a very public contested debate around vaccines and the use of vaccines at a point in time. But I'm not aware of that being the case in Scotland, and the general slippery slope arguments would apply, but it's not something I'm particularly concerned about at this moment in time. Whatever proposal there was to extend this sort of... Oh, have I lost?
It's terrible. I'm catching your eye, but you're on screen. I'm trying to interrupt you over the thing. It's not. I was just going to ask. I suppose it was more about the sort of the wider issue, that point to. I can't sort of imagine anything else where we'd be even discussing sort of policing people, what they're thinking. And I guess we've got examples quite close to home where protesting of which would, I think, probably be seen as more mainstream, is being cracked down upon. So do you have any sort of views on that?
Well, I would go back to saying that I don't think there's anything in this legislation that can or should be used to interrogate what someone is thinking. It would be the manifestation of how that is presented externally, which is a slightly different but important legal distinction in terms of what is absolute and what is qualified. So I just referenced that. Where I don't think this legislation is trying to police what people think, and if it did or was applied in such a way, I think that would almost certainly raise compliance issues with the European Convention, because Article 9, in terms of what is within the forum integrum, is absolute. But yeah, I have no evidence that this is being considered elsewhere for other issues. You may be aware of that more than I am. However, even if it were the case that somebody was to introduce legislation in 5-10 years' time to extend or replicate buffer zones in other areas, we would still have to apply the same legal tests around fair balance, necessity, proportionality, all of the things we were discussing today. So you would be looking at that proposal on its own merits. And if you did not, or if one did not, it would be capable of being challenged under the Human Rights Act within the current legal framework.
Okay, the other panel members, Rob.
Yeah, I think the sort of the points that Ailey Dixon raised around sort of vaccination was an interesting one, because I think when was considering this issue, then it's that is it too sort of broad or narrow? I think would be content that it's the bill is obviously particularly focused on sort of abortion services and the issues that have gone on there. I think there's draw a sort of parallel to sort of COVID vaccination if people were kind of providing misinformation about outside facilities, or if people were trying to sort of dissuade people from being sort of vaccinated outside, that would potentially be some concern. But I'm not aware of that particularly happening outside vaccination centres. So I think it's quite specific to this particular issue and the sort of the protests that have occurred and the balance of rights there. So be content that it's not, that this sort of bill wouldn't sort of open up sort of wanted things into other areas.
Okay, thank you. Katrina.
Yeah, we would agree broadly with the comments made previously on this. You know, any interference with human rights is always has to be made on a kind of context, case-by-case basis. And here, as you know, I think has already been raised previously in this committee, the rights being balanced here are in a way that the health of folk accessing abortion care against these other rights, in a way it's quite a unique circumstance. And so I think it's quite important for us to underline that we don't think this bill should be seen as setting precedent for curbing other kinds of protest. And if it were in any way, any kind of similar attempts would need to go through the similar kind of scrutiny. So I think it's not necessarily or shouldn't be viewed really as a slippery slope.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think Ailey Dixon wanted to come back in on a supplementary point.
Yeah, apologies, Ms. McGuire. I did remember one example that could be used in this context, useful in this context, which is members may recollect when there were discussions around restrictions on protest outside of the Scottish Parliament, and the Commission did provide dedicated advice on that, where we highlighted a lot of the freedom of expression implications of any decision like that, and the Article 10 rights and the 11 rights relating to assembly. So there was an example, and exactly what we've discussed did happen, that human rights were looked at in context, but an important distinction was made between service users, which is discussed at length. I'll highlight paragraphs 125 and 126 of the Supreme Court's judgment in the reference case, which talk about the very specific context of being a woman or a girl trying to access termination of pregnancy. And they talk at length about some of them maybe have particular circumstances, personal circumstances, and it was an incredibly private but also possibly upsetting experience, and they had no choice but to run the gauntlet of the protests, and protests that happens at perhaps organs of the state or political forums. So there was a provision challenged in Russia that went to the European Court on Human Rights, where there was a general prohibition around protest at courts, and that was found to be disproportionate. So sorry, that came to mind as soon as I finished speaking, but the very careful distinction between the users and the people who are the either intended or end recipients of the activity was made.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Reverend Allison?
Yeah, just a small supplementary point. I suppose to human rights operate different from other law in Scotland. That often you've got this legislative framework that sets out very clearly, black and white, what you're trying to cover. Human rights are more nebulous. Like, if you think when a lot of the human rights early treaties, UN Declaration were written, there was no suggestion that abortion was a human, or the access to abortion was a human right, but that has moved, and we may not be quite there yet, but some of the cases are moving in that direction. I guess my only qualification and why I think there is the potential for this to be extended elsewhere is that rights which are so broadly defined could later, as society changes, be applied in different areas than where they are today. And that's where this may start to set a precedent in abortion. Now, this Act does not cover other areas. I completely accept that. But you are maybe setting precedent in one area that could then be used in others for people wanting to make these arguments. Like, these kind of safe access zones have arisen within a relatively short period around the world, all at once, because people have moved to discuss these issues. We don't know what the next thing around the corner will be.
It's just another relevant case before I bring in Mr McKee is that the Citizens Participation in Public Petitions Committee is considering petition number 2049, calling for the Scottish Government to introduce buffer zones outside migrant accommodation to protect occupants from demonstrations by anti-migrant groups. And whilst noting that there were a number of issues to be dealt with, the Scottish Government has committed to looking into the feasibility of that proposal. So it might be another case that is worth considering. Mr McKee.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. And I was going to cite that exact case plus some others, because this morning, of course, we had one of the witnesses citing protests at Dungavel, which of course are the same issue, but from the opposite perspective. We've had obviously citing of Faz Lane protests. We've currently got protests around about arms manufacturers in the context of the Israel-Gaza conflict outside places of work. We've got, in respect to this legislation, it's already been aired, questions round about what is the scope for that also to catch protests round about cuts to health services, and I've protested outside hospitals with regard to arguing against closures or malpractice issues, or a whole range of, or even ministerial visits has been cited as a legitimate area for protesting outside healthcare facilities. And of course, the UK legislation, if I understand it correctly, and you're lawyers and I'm not, some of you, was in the context of broader legislation round about protest. So I don't know if you want to reflect on some of that, just to give us more comfort or not round about the scope for scope creep.
If I could just raise one aspect of that, I think that phrase "protest" again has come up before. That because this legislation does talk about influencing, persuading, it goes beyond protest, and that's one of the reasons why I feel that could be applied in other areas about influencing people, persuading people on certain issues. And obviously that's something as a church we're quite concerned about. We do want to persuade people and have the freedom to do that. So this is not exclusively about protest, and that's one of the reasons I have concerns about extension.
Likewise, as a politician, we're in the influencing business as well.
Any other points made on that? No, okay. Move to Dr. Sandesh Gohan. Thank you.
And just to declare my interest as a practicing NHS GP, Katrina, I'm going to focus on you quite a lot in this, so sorry about that. But can I just pick up on other protests that potentially could be stopped? Because we heard in a previous panel from police and from a solicitor that this legislation might stop any protest about anything. So, for example, about El Jamal. Is that your understanding?
I'm not clear that that is necessarily the case. I think that's something that, if there is a query around that in the legislation, should be made clear. There are obviously legislative frameworks for other forms of protest, for example, trade unions, so on and so forth. So if that's not clear, I would encourage the committee to make sure that is clear. Yeah.
Okay. Would you be able to possibly write to us to help us come to some sort of wording to make that clearer? And also, obviously this is Scotland, but do you have some understanding of whether that is the case in other jurisdictions, like in England and Wales or Northern Ireland?
That's something we can add to
okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I also would like to ask about private homes.
Yes.
So our understanding is that if you are in a private home within the buffer zone, you cannot put graphic images or other such protests or either way in your windows or around your garden to influence. Do you think that is proportional? And is this, it's a two-part question, is this the same, again, around in other jurisdictions in England and Wales and Northern Ireland?
So, to my awareness, in England and Wales, where they landed was, obviously, I don't think anyone's suggesting covering anything inside private homes, nor here nor anywhere else, but they did cover, in their legislation, which is not yet enforced, activities which can be visible or audible. In terms of whether it's proportionate, again, I would put a question mark on that for now, and it's something that I think is another topic that we're quite keen to review in the Law Society and come back to you on. Is that something that's maybe not quite so clear?
Okay, and maybe if I could open that question up to the panel, do you feel that the private home section is proportionate?
I think I've already made it clear, probably not. It does go beyond other jurisdictions and what seems to have been done and what was considered in the Supreme Court case. And I do think, due to the lack of clarity as to what exactly might be covered, that could be quite easily disproportionate in some cases. But yeah, it's it's not as clear-cut. It seems to have been tagged on to the legislation as an extension because there is a potential impact, and we don't feel it's proportionate, no.
Okay, thank you. Can I also, sorry if I may, Stephen, pick up a little bit on some of the questions that I asked in the last panel, right at the very end, about information being given to people that are going past. The leaflets I was provided with had gross medical inaccuracies. I mean, it's quite concerning.
Yeah.
And there's no policing of that type of information. So what are your thoughts about the information that is potentially given to people?
So it is a very... So we would similarly... It's quite complicated. I think we would condemn those leaflets which are inaccurate, and I think that would not be anything... So, as I say, we are not really engaged in these, so we wouldn't be using such leaflets and inadequate information. I do think there's a broader concern of creating the impression that only healthcare professionals can give any information about any issue, actually, but particularly abortion, because there are ethical and moral concerns as well, which are not going to be developed scientifically. I think some of the issues over mental health are disputed within the scientific community, and I think there are challenges about that and issues over coercion as well in the wider context. So we raised in our evidence the example, right, so it's quite interesting what Rob said about not wanting someone to be coerced or unduly influenced, but that's happening both ways, because there is evidence of people being coerced to have an abortion by other family members in various ways, and we cited the BBC's research that they conducted, and also issues about deprivation, poverty. So there's a lot of factors beyond medicine connected to abortion that actually is not something necessarily the NHS are going to be able to provide information on. There's not the money or resource to provide certain support to women facing these decisions. And I think that is where there is some amazing work being done by certain organisations, not necessarily those protesting, but there are organisations who do provide helplines, who do provide support to people to consider other options. So I don't think you should restrict it to only medical professionals can decide what is appropriate medically. We have to be able to enter into debate and discussion about some of the more contested issues, while recognising that where something is clearly misleading, right, the breast cancer claims are just awful, and I think we would all agree that's awful, that kind of thing. I've heard someone attempt to justify why they thought that would be allowed, and it's not clear. And so, while condemning those particular leaflets, while condemning misinformation, I think we should all strive to be as accurate. I think truth matters as a value to us as a church. Abortion is not just a medical issue.
And I would say that as a GP, I do have people coming, and there's a lot of factors. Very clearly a lot of factors. It's not simply a medical procedure. But I do have another question for you directly. Again, on one of the leaflets, the number took me to 40 Days for Life. And within the website that I've landed on, it says, with God's help, here are the proven results in 30 coordinated campaigns. Over 100 abortion centres closed. Is that the point of the protest, to close abortion centres?
That's a difficult question to answer as someone who doesn't engage in these protests at all. I think there are probably a multiplicity of reasons why people engage in this kind of behaviour. Some people I've spoken to have a huge concern for the women involved and to care for the individual woman that they encounter, and that's very clear. Others do, and now, of course, then if they have issues if they are pro-life, then they do believe abortion clinics should be closed. But that may not be the direct issue why they're doing this. There's actually differences of opinion within the pro-life movement between some organisations that want full abolishment of abortion, and some who want an incremental, reducing the limits, various things, and what is the correct approach to campaigning to these kind of things. And so there's a huge range of reasons why people are involved in these practices. I think, in general, though, we have to accept that people are allowed to have multiple motivations for why they engage in and exercise their rights. So yes, I think it is, but I can't necessarily. I'm slightly sceptical that claim is true, to be honest with you, based on what I've seen, that they've closed so many abortion clinics, and I think that kind of, if this is the same organisation that seems to have had other misleading claims, then you may not want to weight stuff in that. But yeah, I don't. It's hard to know. Just slightly on what you just said a moment ago as well about being a GP. Actually, I have had more positive reports from GPs about the conversations they've had with people considering termination, because I think GPs tend to know their patients more, know the wider circumstances, and that's been very positive. I guess there are concerns about what information is provided by the service providers at that port, and if people are going directly to service providers. But actually, GPs seem to be better in this area, so I think that is encouraging.
And that's why primary care is the best type of care. But thank you very much for this very complicated question.
Thank you very much. Thank our witnesses for, unless there's any other points you wish to raise that you don't think we've covered so far in the evidence sessions, please do let me know. Okay, everyone seems content to rest on that. If there is any further items you want to correspond with us on, more than welcome to receive that. I think there's been some discussion about some items of correspondence that we'll follow up with. But just to reiterate our thanks for your time today to come to the committee and help us scrutinise this legislation. So thank you. At our next meeting on the 19th of March, we will conclude taking evidence as part of the committee's Stage 1 scrutiny of the Abortion Services Safe Access Zone Scotland Bill, hearing for the Minister for Public Health and Women's Health, and then the member in charge of the bill, Gillian Mackay, MSP. And with that, that concludes the public part of our meeting today. Thank you.